The blizzard had been howling for 3 days when Clara's fever spiked, and Ethan Crowell knew he was about to lose another daughter to the same sickness that had taken his wife. But the foreign woman he'd purchased like livestock, the quiet Chinese bride the town mocked as too delicate for frontier life, didn't flinch. Instead, Lin Xia knelt beside the burning child and said 5 words that shattered everything Ethan thought he knew about strength. "I will not let her die." What happened in that snowbound cabin would force a man who'd forgotten how to feel to choose between the ghost of his past and the fierce, unexpected woman fighting to save his future. Welcome to a story of survival, redemption, and love, forged in the unforgiving heart of the American frontier. If this tale moves you, hit that like button and comment your city below. I want to see how far across the world this journey travels. Now settle in as we begin. The train's whistle cut through Redstone Hollow like a blade through winter air, sharp and unforgiving. Ethan Crowell stood on the wooden platform, his broad shoulders squared against the biting wind that swept down from the mountains, carrying with it the promise of an early snow. Around him, the usual crowd had gathered, merchants waiting for supplies, ranch hands looking for work, women clutching shawls against the cold. But today their eyes weren't on the cargo cars or the mail sacks being unloaded. They were watching him. "Heard you sent for a bride, Crowell," Jacob Wheeler called out from beside the general store, his voice carrying that particular edge of amusement men get when they think they've caught someone in an act of weakness. "Didn't think you had it in you. 3 years after Mary passed." Ethan didn't turn. His jaw tightened, the muscle there working beneath sun-weathered skin that had seen 34 hard winters. His hands, calloused from rope and leather, and the relentless work of keeping a ranch alive in territory that didn't forgive mistakes, hung loose at his sides. He'd learned long ago that silence served him better than words in this town. "Must be desperate," someone else muttered, and a few men chuckled. Let them laugh. Ethan had stopped caring about the opinions of Redstone Hollow the day he'd buried his wife in frozen ground, too hard to dig properly. He was here for one reason only, to collect the solution to a problem that had been slowly destroying what remained of his life. Clara needed a woman's care. His 8-year-old daughter had been fading like a candle in a draft ever since Mary died, growing quieter and more distant with each passing month. The housekeeper he'd hired had lasted 2 weeks before declaring the isolation unholy and fleeing back to Denver. The ranch itself was falling apart without someone to manage the household while he worked the land. He needed help, simple as that. So he'd done what desperate men on the frontier did. He'd written to a marriage broker in San Francisco, a man named Tobias Marsh, who specialized in matching women with prospects out west. Ethan had been clear in his requirements: someone practical, someone who understood hard work, someone who wouldn't expect romance or pretty words, someone who could cook, clean, and tend to a grieving child without asking for anything he couldn't give. The train shuddered to a complete stop, steam hissing from beneath its massive iron wheels. Doors opened and passengers began to emerge. A family with 3 children, a salesman with a heavy trunk, 2 cowboys headed for the cattle ranches south of town. And then she stepped down. The platform fell silent. Ethan had been expecting someone weathered, someone whose face showed the hard miles of a difficult life. He'd imagined a woman in her 30s or 40s, broad-shouldered and plain, the kind who'd learned to survive through sheer stubborn endurance. He'd prepared himself for awkward introductions and a business-like arrangement. The woman who descended from the train car shattered every one of those assumptions. She was young, mid-20s at most, and moved with a grace that seemed utterly incongruous with the rough wooden platform and the crude frontier town surrounding it. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, was pulled back in a simple style that somehow made her look both modest and elegant. She wore a dark blue traveling dress, worn but clean, that suggested careful maintenance rather than poverty. But it was her face that stopped Ethan's breath in his chest. She was beautiful, not in the robust, red-cheeked way of the farmers' daughters who sometimes came to town dances. There was something delicate about her features, something that made her look as though the harsh wind might blow her away like cottonwood down. Her eyes, dark and fathomless, held a sorrow so deep it was almost tangible, the kind of grief that spoke of losses that couldn't be measured or easily explained. She was also unmistakably Chinese. The murmuring started immediately, rippling through the crowd like wind through dry grass. That can't be Crowell's bride. A Chinese woman? Out here? She won't last a month. Too fragile. What was Marsh thinking, sending her to territory like this? Ethan stood frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd expected. This couldn't be right. There had to be some mistake. But then she turned her head, and her eyes met his across the platform, searching, uncertain, but carrying a quiet determination beneath the sorrow. She knew who he was. Mr. Crowell. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying a slight accent that shaped the English words with careful precision. She approached him with a small carpetbag in her hands, the only luggage she seemed to possess. I am Lin Xia. Mr. Marsh sent me. Up close, she was even more striking, and even more impossible. Her hands were small and delicate, her frame slight beneath the traveling dress. She looked like she'd never done a day's hard labor in her life. There's been a mistake, Ethan said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. I asked for someone practical, Lin Xia interrupted gently. Someone who understands hard work. Someone to care for your daughter and manage your household. Her eyes held his, and he saw something flicker there. Not defiance exactly, but a quiet refusal to be dismissed. Mr. Marsh described your requirements in his letter. I accepted them. You don't understand what you're getting into, Ethan said, aware of the crowd pressing closer, hungry for drama. This isn't San Francisco. This is hard country. The ranch is 10 miles from town, and winter's coming. The work is... I understand hardship, Mr. Crowell. Her voice remained calm, but something in it made him stop. I have known cold. I have known hunger. I have known loss. She paused, and for just a moment, that deep sorrow in her eyes became almost overwhelming. I did not come here expecting comfort. I came here because I had nowhere else to go, and you offered a place. If you will honor the arrangement, I will fulfill my duties. Behind them, Jacob Wheeler laughed. Duties? Listen to her, Crowell. She talks like it's a business contract, not a marriage. That's exactly what it is, Ethan said sharply, turning to face the gathered crowd. And it's none of your concern. He looked back at Lin Xia, studying her face, trying to see past the beauty and the fragility to whatever strength might lie beneath. Can you cook? Yes. Clean, sew, manage a household? Yes. Care for a child who barely speaks and doesn't smile anymore? Lin Xia's expression softened almost imperceptibly. I will try. It wasn't the confident answer he'd hoped for, but it was honest. And honesty, Ethan had learned, was rarer than gold in this territory. The wagon's over there, he said finally, gesturing toward the dirt street where his flatbed wagon waited, hitched to 2 patient draft horses. We leave now. It's a 2-hour ride to the ranch, and I want to be back before dark. He turned and walked toward the wagon without waiting to see if she would follow, his boots heavy on the wooden platform. Behind him, he heard the whispers intensify, speculation about how long she'd last, whether she'd run back to California within a week, whether Ethan Crowell had finally lost his mind along with his wife. Let them talk. He had a ranch to run and a daughter who needed him. Lin Xia climbed onto the wagon seat with surprising ease, settling her carpetbag at her feet. She didn't speak as Ethan took the reins, didn't ask questions or make observations about the town. She simply sat, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes taking in the rough buildings and dirt streets of Redstone Hollow, with an expression that revealed nothing. The wagon rolled forward, leaving the platform and the gossips behind. They rode in silence through the town, past the general store and the saloon, past the church with its crooked steeple, and the schoolhouse that only operated 6 months of the year. A few people stopped to stare as they passed, but Ethan kept his eyes forward, focused on the road ahead. It wasn't until they'd left the last buildings behind and entered the open prairie that Lin Xia finally spoke. Your daughter, she said quietly. What is her name? Clara. And her mother? How long has she been gone? 3 years? Ethan's voice came out flat, discouraging further questions. Fever took her in 2 days. Nothing anyone could do. Lin Xia nodded slowly, as if filing this information away. It is hard to lose someone so quickly, to have no time to prepare. You can't prepare for death, Ethan said. It comes when it comes. No, Lin Xia agreed, her voice growing even softer. You cannot prepare. But sometimes, if you are fortunate, you have time to say goodbye, to say the things that need to be said. She paused. I did not have that fortune. Ethan glanced at her sharply. Her face remained composed, but her hands had tightened slightly in her lap. What happened? Fire. The single word carried a weight that needed no elaboration. My family, my parents, my younger brother, they were all inside when it started. I was at the market. By the time I returned, she stopped, drawing a slow breath. There was nothing left to save. The prairie stretched out around them, endless grass rippling in the wind like an ocean of gold and brown. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. I'm sorry, Ethan said, the words feeling inadequate and clumsy in his mouth. Thank you. Lincia's voice steadied. It was 2 years ago, in San Francisco. After I had no family, no home. I worked where I could, cleaning houses, mending clothes, but work was difficult to find for someone like me. Too many people did not want a Chinese woman in their homes. Her tone remained matter-of-fact, without self-pity. When I saw Mr. Marsh's advertisement seeking women willing to travel west for marriage, I thought perhaps this was a place where the past would matter less than the work I could do. Ethan understood that reasoning. The frontier had a way of stripping people down to their essentials, what you could build, what you could survive, what you could endure. Out here, your past mattered less than your ability to face tomorrow, but it also had a way of breaking people who weren't strong enough. The ranch is isolated, he said, needing her to understand what she was agreeing to. 10 miles from town over rough road. In winter, sometimes we can't get to Redstone Hollow for weeks at a time. There's no society, no other women nearby to talk to, just me, Clara, and the land. I am accustomed to solitude, Lincia replied. The work is hard. I won't lie about that. The cabin needs constant maintenance. Clara needs attention and care. There's cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending, preserving food for winter. And sometimes, when I'm working the far pastures, you might be alone with Clara for days. I understand. I need you to be certain, Ethan pressed, surprising himself with the intensity in his voice. Because if you get out there and decide you can't handle it, there's no easy way back. The wagon trip is long, and I can't be making runs to town every week because you changed your mind. Lincia turned to look at him directly, and he saw something shift in her expression, a flash of steel beneath the quiet surface. Mr. Crowell, I watched my family burn. I have survived 2 years alone in a city that did not want me, taking any work I could find, sleeping in rooms so small I could not stand upright. I have known hunger that made my hands shake, and cold that made my bones ache. I have endured things you cannot imagine. Her voice remained soft, but each word landed with absolute certainty. I did not travel across dangerous territory to your frontier so that I could run away at the first sign of difficulty. I came here to build a life. If you will allow me to do so, I will not fail in my duties. Ethan found himself believing her. There was something in her eyes, that deep, sorrowful strength, that spoke of survival earned through fire and loss. She might look fragile, but she'd clearly learned to endure. All right, he said finally, then we'll make it work. They rode on in silence after that, the wagon creaking rhythmically as the horses pulled them deeper into the prairie. The sun climbed higher, warming the air slightly, though the wind never quite stopped. Around them, the land stretched endlessly, rolling hills of grass broken occasionally by clusters of cottonwood trees marking hidden creek beds. It was beautiful country in its way, harsh and unforgiving, but beautiful. After an hour, Lincia spoke again. Tell me about Clara. What does she enjoy? What makes her smile? Ethan's hands tightened on the reins. She used to like everything, drawing, singing, helping her mother in the garden. After Mary died, she just stopped. Now she barely speaks, moves through the house like a ghost. And you? What have you tried? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? To reach her, to bring her back from her grief. Ethan's jaw clenched. I work. I provide. I keep the ranch running so she has a home and food and a future. That's what a father does. Yes, Lincia said gently. But what does a father do for a daughter's heart? The question hit harder than any accusation. Ethan wanted to snap back to defend himself, But the words died in his throat, because the truth was he didn't know. He'd been so consumed by his own grief, so focused on the physical demands of survival, that he'd lost sight of anything beyond the daily necessities. "I don't know how to reach her," he admitted finally, the confession scraping out of him like splinters. "Every time I try to talk to her, I see Mary in her face and I—" He stopped, unable to finish. "You see your loss," Lin Xia completed quietly, "and it becomes too painful to look." "Yes, then perhaps," she said, "it is fortunate that I do not carry that pain. When I look at Clara, I will see only Clara. Perhaps that will be enough." Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They rode on, the sun climbing toward noon, and gradually the landscape began to change. The open prairie gave way to rougher terrain, rocky outcroppings, steeper hills, patches of scrub pine. In the distance, mountains rose against the horizon, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "Almost there," Ethan said as they crested a ridge. Below them, nestled in a shallow valley beside a meandering creek, sat the ranch. It wasn't much. A log cabin with a stone chimney, a small barn, a corral with split-rail fencing, and a few outbuildings in various states of repair. The land around it showed signs of cultivation. A vegetable garden gone to seed, a small orchard of struggling fruit trees, pastures where cattle grazed in scattered groups. But it was also clearly neglected. The cabin's roof needed patching. The barn door hung crooked. Weeds had overtaken what should have been the yard. Even from a distance, the place had an air of abandonment, as though its inhabitants had given up on anything beyond bare survival. Lin Xia said nothing as they descended toward the ranch, but Ethan could imagine what she was thinking. This was what she'd traveled all this way for. A rundown cabin in the middle of nowhere, with a grief-stricken child and a man who'd forgotten how to be anything but numb. The wagon rolled into the yard, and Ethan set the brake. Before he could move to help Lin Xia down, the cabin door opened. Clara stood in the doorway. She was small for 8 years old, with her mother's delicate features and dark blonde hair that hung in tangles around her thin shoulders. She wore a faded dress that had clearly been mended multiple times, and her feet were bare despite the cool air. Her eyes, Mary's eyes, that same startling blue, were huge in her pale face. She stared at Lin Xia with an expression Ethan couldn't read. Lin Xia climbed down from the wagon with quiet grace, her carpetbag in hand. She walked toward the cabin slowly, not rushing, not making any sudden movements. When she reached Clara, she knelt down, bringing herself to the child's eye level. "Hello, Clara," she said softly. "My name is Lin Xia. Your father has asked me to come and help take care of you and your home. Would that be all right with you?" Clara said nothing. She just stared at Lin Xia with those enormous blue eyes, her expression frozen somewhere between curiosity and fear. "You don't have to answer right now," Lin Xia continued, her voice remaining gentle. "I understand that having a stranger arrive is strange and perhaps frightening, but I want you to know that I am here to help, not to replace anyone or take anything away. Your mother, she will always be your mother. I could never be her. I am only here to care for you, if you will let me." Something flickered across Clara's face. Surprise, maybe, that this stranger understood without being told. She glanced past Lin Xia to where Ethan stood by the wagon, a question in her eyes. "It's all right, Clara," Ethan said, his voice rough. "Lin Xia is going to stay with us. She's here to help." Clara's gaze returned to Lin Xia, studying her with an intensity that seemed far too old for a child. Finally, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. It was the most response Ethan had gotten from his daughter in months. Lin Xia smiled, a small, genuine expression that softened her whole face. "Thank you, Clara. Now, may I come inside and see your home?" Clara stepped back, allowing Lin Xia to enter the cabin. Ethan followed, carrying the carpetbag, and as he crossed the threshold, he tried to see the place through Lin Xia's eyes. It was worse than he'd thought. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space altogether. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold ashes spilling onto the hearth. A rough wooden table stood in the center, its surface scarred and sticky with old spills. Dishes were piled in a basin, unwashed. Clothes lay scattered across the furniture. The floor was tracked with mud and dust. The windows, grimy and streaked, let in only dim light. 2 doors led to small bedrooms, one that had been his and Mary's, which he still used, and one that was Clara's. A ladder led to a loft space used for storage. The whole place smelled of neglect, stale air, old food, unwashed fabric. Lincia moved through the space slowly, her expression neutral, taking in every detail. She paused at the fireplace, at the table, at the window. She opened the cupboards, examined the stove, looked into the bedrooms. Through it all, Clara followed her like a silent shadow. Finally, Lincia turned to face Ethan. "Where will I sleep?" He hadn't thought that far ahead. "The loft, I suppose. I can bring down a mattress." "The loft will be fine," she interrupted. "I do not need much space. But I will need to clean first. Everything needs to be cleaned." It wasn't a criticism, just a statement of fact, but Ethan felt defensive anyway. "I've been managing as best I can between the ranch work and—" "I understand," Lincia said, cutting him off gently. "You have been surviving, but now I am here, and we can do more than survive. If you will show me where you keep your cleaning supplies, I will begin." Something about the quiet authority in her voice made Ethan want to argue, to assert his own control over his household. But the truth was, she was right. They had been barely surviving. And if she was willing to take on the work of making this place livable again, who was he to object? "Under the sink," he said, gesturing to the kitchen area. "There's soap, brushes, rags. Water comes from the well outside." Lincia nodded and set down her carpet bag. She removed her travel jacket, revealing a simple blouse beneath, and rolled up her sleeves. Without another word, she went to the sink and began gathering supplies. Ethan stood there for a moment, uncertain. He had ranch work waiting, fences to check, cattle to count, a dozen tasks that couldn't be delayed. But leaving felt strange, like abandoning her to face the disaster he'd created. "I need to check the north pasture," he said finally. "I'll be back before dark. If you need anything, we will manage," Lincia said, already filling a bucket with water from the pitcher on the counter. "Go do your work, Mr. Crowell. Clara and I will be fine." Clara, who had been watching everything in silence, suddenly moved. She walked to the corner where a basket of mending sat, abandoned for weeks, and picked up a needle and thread. Then she carried them to the table and sat down, her small hands beginning to work on a torn shirt. Helping. Ethan felt something crack in his chest, a fissure in the wall of ice he'd built around his heart 3 years ago. Clara hadn't voluntarily helped with anything in months. She'd moved through the house like a ghost, doing only what was absolutely required and nothing more. But now, with this stranger who'd been in their home less than 10 minutes, she was choosing to participate. "I'll be back before dark," Ethan repeated, his voice thick. Then he turned and walked out of the cabin before anyone could see his face. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain. Ethan unhitched the horses from the wagon and led them to the barn, his mind churning. Everything about this situation was wrong. The bride who didn't match his expectations, the beauty that would draw unwanted attention, the delicate appearance that seemed so at odds with frontier life. And yet, there had been something in the way Lincia moved through that disaster of a cabin, not judgment, not horror, just calm assessment and immediate action. There had been something in the way she'd spoken to Clara, respectful, honest, without false promises or empty comfort. Maybe Marsh had known what he was doing after all. Ethan saddled his workhorse and rode out to check the pastures, but his mind kept drifting back to the cabin, to the quiet woman who'd stepped off the train with nothing but a carpet bag and a history of loss, to his daughter, picking up a needle for the first time in months, to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, his house might become a home again. The hours passed with the steady rhythm of familiar work. Ethan rode the fence lines, checking for breaks, counting cattle, making mental notes of repairs that would be needed before winter truly set in. The physical labor helped settle his mind, the familiar motions grounding him in the present. But as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, he found himself riding back faster than usual, driven by an anxiety he couldn't quite name. What would he find when he returned? Would Lincia still be there, or would she have recognized the impossibility of the situation and demanded to be taken back to town? Would Clara have retreated back into her shell? Would the cabin still be the same disaster he'd left that morning? The answers awaited him as he crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, straight and steady in the evening air. As he rode closer, he could see that the yard had been swept clean of debris. The clothes that had been scattered across the porch were gone. The windows. The windows were clean. Even from a distance, he could see light shining through them, warm and welcoming. Ethan dismounted in the barn and took his time caring for the horse, unsaddling and brushing the animal down, checking its hooves, measuring out feed, delaying, because he didn't know what he'd find inside that cabin, and part of him was afraid to discover that the changes he'd seen were just surface improvements hiding the same emptiness beneath. Finally, he couldn't delay any longer. He walked across the darkening yard to the cabin door and paused, his hand on the latch. Inside, he heard something he hadn't heard in 3 years. Laughter. His daughter's laughter. Ethan opened the door. The transformation was so complete that for a moment he thought he'd walked into the wrong cabin. The floor had been scrubbed clean, the boards showing their natural color instead of layers of dirt. The table shone with fresh polish, its surface cleared of clutter. The dishes had been washed and stacked on shelves that had also been cleaned and organized. The window sparkled, letting in the last golden light of sunset. The fireplace had been swept, a fresh fire burning brightly on the hearth. The smell, instead of stale neglect, the cabin smelled of bread and herbs and something savory cooking on the stove. And at the table, Clara sat with a wooden spoon in her hand, helping Linxia stir something in a large bowl. Both of them looked up as he entered, and Clara was smiling. Actually smiling. "Papa," Clara said, the first word she'd spoken to him in days. "Linxia is teaching me to make dumplings. Real dumplings like they make in China." Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process the scene before him. Linxia had changed from her traveling dress into a simpler work dress, her hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her sleeves were rolled up, and there was flour on her hands and a slight flush to her cheeks from the heat of the stove. She looked tired. She also looked completely at ease. "Mr. Crowell," she said with a small nod, "your timing is good. Dinner will be ready soon. Please sit. You must be hungry after working all day." Ethan didn't know what to say. "You didn't have to do all this." "I did," Linxia said simply. "This is my home now, too, and a home should be clean and welcoming." She turned back to the bowl, her hands working the dough with practiced efficiency. "Clara has been a wonderful helper. She showed me where everything was kept and helped me carry water from the well." But Clara beamed at the praise, her whole face lighting up in a way Ethan had almost forgotten was possible. "She's very strong," Linxia continued, still working the dough. "Much stronger than she looks. Like her father, I think." The compliment, offered so casually, caught Ethan off guard. He cleared his throat and moved further into the cabin, unsure where to put himself. The space felt different, not just cleaner, but alive in a way it hadn't been since Mary died. "Sit," Linxia repeated, more firmly this time. "You have worked hard. Now it is time to rest." Ethan sat. Within minutes, Linxia had plates on the table, steaming bowls of soup filled with dumplings, fresh bread that must have been baking while he was gone, vegetables he recognized from the root cellar, prepared in a way he'd never seen before. The food smelled incredible. Clara climbed into her chair, still smiling, still more animated than Ethan had seen her in months. Linxia served them both before sitting down herself, her movements graceful and efficient. "Eat," she said simply, "before it gets cold." Ethan picked up his spoon, feeling strangely awkward in his own home. He tasted the soup. It was delicious, complex and flavorful in a way his simple frontier cooking had never been. The dumplings were perfectly tender, the broth rich and satisfying. "This is really good," he said, and heard the surprise in his own voice. Linxia's expression didn't change, but something softened in her eyes. "Thank you. It is a simple recipe my mother taught me. I thought Clara might enjoy learning it." "It's my favorite," Clara announced, attacking her bowl with an enthusiasm that made Ethan's chest tighten. When had she last been enthusiastic about anything? They ate in silence for a while, but it wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence that had filled the cabin for so long. This was different, peaceful, almost comfortable. As they finished, Linxia began clearing the dishes. "Clara, it is time for you to prepare for bed." "But I'm not tired," Clara protested, though her eyes were already drooping. Perhaps not, Lin Xia said gently, but tomorrow is a new day, and you will need your strength for all the things we will do. Go wash your face and hands, and I will come tuck you in shortly. To Ethan's amazement, Clara obeyed without argument. She slipped from her chair and disappeared into her bedroom, the door closing softly behind her. Ethan stood and began helping with the dishes, unsure what else to do. They worked side by side at the basin, Lin Xia washing while he dried, the domesticity of the moment almost overwhelming. "You've done a lot today," he said finally, searching for the right words. "More than I expected." "It needed to be done," Lin Xia replied, her hands moving steadily in the soapy water. "A house cannot be a home if it is not cared for." And Clara, she needed to feel that care, to know that someone sees her worth the effort. The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples Ethan couldn't contain. "I see her worth," he said, defensive. "She's my daughter. Everything I do is for her." "I know," Lin Xia said, her voice remaining gentle. "But sometimes, especially for children, love must be shown in more than provision. It must be shown in presence, in attention, in small moments of joy that remind them life is worth living." "Mary used to do that," Ethan said, the admission scraping out of him. "She knew how to make Clara laugh, how to make everything feel light and happy. I don't have that gift. I never did." "Perhaps not," Lin Xia agreed. "But you do not need to be Mary. You only need to be Clara's father. And being a father means more than working yourself to exhaustion. It means seeing your child, truly seeing her, and reminding her that she is not alone in her grief." The truth in her words cut deeper than any blade. Ethan set down the dish he was drying, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I don't know how to do that. Every time I look at her, I see Mary, and it hurts so much I can barely breathe." "I understand," Lin Xia said softly. "When I see certain things, a flash of red fabric, the smell of incense, I see my family burning. The pain is so sharp I must stop moving until it passes. But we cannot let our pain steal our future. Clara is still here, she is still alive, and she needs you to be here too, not just in body, but in spirit." She finished the last dish and dried her hands, turning to face him fully. In the firelight, her features seemed both strong and vulnerable, that sorrow in her eyes mixing with something else. Determination, perhaps, or hope. "I will do what I can to help her," Lin Xia said, "to care for this home and bring some light back into it. But I cannot replace you in her heart. Only you can choose to be present for your daughter. Only you can decide whether to remain frozen in grief or to live again." The words settled over Ethan like weight, not accusation, but invitation. A challenge to be more than he'd been, to find a way back from the numbness that had protected him from pain, but also from everything else. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice rough. "I don't know if I'll be any good at it, but I'll try." Lin Xia nodded, acceptance and understanding in her expression. "That is all anyone can do. Try and keep trying until one day it becomes easier." She moved toward Clara's room. "I will tuck her in now. Tomorrow, we begin again." She disappeared into the bedroom, leaving Ethan alone in the transformed cabin. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the murmur of Lin Xia's voice through the door, too soft to make out words but soothing in its rhythm. After a while, he heard Clara's sleepy response, then silence. Lin Xia emerged quietly, closing the door behind her. "She is asleep. She was more tired than she wanted to admit." "Thank you," Ethan said. "For today. For all of this." "You do not need to thank me," Lin Xia replied. "This is the arrangement we made. I am fulfilling my part." "Still," Ethan insisted, I don't know what I expected, but not this. Not someone who could walk into this disaster and make it feel like a home again in a single day." Lin Xia's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, perhaps surprised that he'd noticed, or that he'd said it aloud. "It is not yet a home," she said quietly, "but it could be. With time and patience and work, it could be." She moved past him to collect her carpet bag from where she'd left it by the door. "If you will excuse me, I should prepare the loft for sleeping. Tomorrow will be another long day." "Wait," Ethan said, and she paused. "I just want you to know, I know this isn't what you probably expected either. A rundown ranch, a man who doesn't talk much, a child locked in grief." But I'm glad you're here. Already, just in one day, I can see the difference you've made. So, thank you for staying, for trying." Lincia studied him for a long moment, and he had the strange sensation of being truly seen, not just looked at, but understood in a way that made him uncomfortable and grateful all at once. "You are welcome," she said finally. "Now, good night, Mr. Crowell. Rest well." She climbed the ladder to the loft, her carpet bag in hand, and disappeared into the shadows above. Ethan stood alone in the cabin, surrounded by the changes she'd wrought in a single day. Clean floors, clear windows, the lingering warmth of a good meal, the echo of his daughter's laughter. For the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. He banked the fire for the night and retreated to his own room, his mind still churning with everything that had happened. The bride who'd stepped off the train had been nothing like what he expected. More beautiful, more fragile-looking, more foreign. But she'd also proven to be more capable, more determined, and more perceptive than he could have imagined. She'd walked into his broken household and immediately begun putting the pieces back together. Not by force or criticism, but through quiet competence and genuine care. Maybe, Ethan thought as he lay down in the bed he'd slept in alone for 3 years, maybe Marsh had sent exactly the right woman after all. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the newly cleaned windows. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon. And in the loft above, Lincia prepared for her first night in her new home, alone with her memories and her losses, but no longer without purpose. The marriage bought by loneliness had begun. Where it would lead, neither of them could yet know. But in the transformed cabin, in the warmth of the banked fire, and the clean surfaces, and the echo of a child's laughter, the first fragile seeds of possibility had been planted. Time would tell if they could survive the harsh frontier winter ahead. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both strange and inevitable, like water finding its course through new terrain. Ethan rose before dawn each morning, as he always had, to tend the animals and check the land. But now, when he returned to the cabin for breakfast, he found the table set with hot food and Clara already awake, helping Lincia prepare the meal. It was such a small change, such an ordinary thing, and yet it shattered the frozen routine that had governed their lives for 3 years. On the third morning, Ethan paused in the doorway, watching as Lincia showed Clara how to flip Johnny cakes on the griddle without burning them. His daughter's face was intent with concentration, her small hands careful on the spatula. When she successfully flipped one without breaking it, she looked up at Lincia with such pride that Ethan's throat tightened. "Good," Lincia said, her voice warm with approval. "You are learning quickly. Soon you will not need my help at all." "I'll always need your help," Claire said, the words coming out with a child's absolute certainty. Then, more quietly, "Will you really stay? Or will you leave like Mrs. Henderson did?" Lincia's hands stilled for just a moment. Then she knelt down, bringing herself to Clara's eye level, and spoke with the same honesty she'd shown from the beginning. "Mrs. Henderson left because she could not endure the isolation. But I am not Mrs. Henderson. I came here knowing this would be my home, and I do not abandon my home simply because things are difficult." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "I will not lie to you, Clara. I cannot promise that nothing will ever change. Life is uncertain, and sometimes circumstances force us to make hard choices. But I can promise you this, I will not leave unless I have no other choice. And if such a time ever comes, I will tell you honestly, so you are not left wondering." Clara studied her face with those 2 old eyes, searching for truth. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly and returned to the Johnny cakes. Ethan cleared his throat, announcing his presence. "Smells good." Both of them turned, and he saw Clara's smile falter slightly, that familiar retreat she'd learned to make whenever he entered a room. It cut him, that instinctive withdrawal, but he understood it. He'd been so absent, so locked in his own grief, that his daughter had learned not to expect anything from him. Lincia's words from that first night echoed in his mind. Being a father means more than working yourself to exhaustion. It means seeing your child, truly seeing her. "Clara," he said, forcing himself to step further into the cabin instead of immediately heading for the table. "Those Johnny cakes look perfect. You've gotten good at that." His daughter's eyes widened with surprise. "Lincia taught me." She says the secret is to wait until you see bubbles before you flip them. Smart advice, Ethan said, moving to stand beside them at the stove. He watched as Clara carefully monitored the cakes, waiting for the bubbles to appear. When they did, she flipped them with the concentrated precision of someone performing a sacred task. Your mother used to make these every Sunday morning. You probably don't remember. Clara looked up at him, and for the first time in months, she didn't look away. I remember a little. She put molasses on them. She did, Ethan confirmed, feeling something crack in his chest. Not painful exactly, but raw. She'd make a whole stack, and we'd eat them while they were still warm. Can we do that? Clara asked tentatively. Make a stack with molasses? It was such a simple request, such an ordinary thing to want. Yeah, Ethan said, his voice rough. We can do that. Lincia said nothing, but as she moved past him to get the molasses from the pantry, her hand brushed his arm. So briefly it might have been accidental, but he felt the gesture's meaning. You are trying. That is enough. They ate breakfast together, the three of them, and for the first time Ethan allowed himself to actually taste the food, instead of just consuming it mechanically. Lincia had a gift for making even simple ingredients into something special. The Johnny cakes were light and perfectly golden, the molasses sweet and rich. The eggs scrambled with herbs he couldn't identify, but that made everything taste brighter. What are you putting in these eggs? He asked. Chives from the garden, Lincia replied, and a little of what you would call green onion. They were still growing near the house, though they needed attention. I also found sage and thyme that had gone wild. With care, the garden could provide much more. Mary planted that garden, Ethan said, the words coming out before he could stop them. She loved growing things, herbs, vegetables, flowers. She said they made the place feel less wild. She had wisdom, Lincia said simply. Growing things reminds us that we are not just surviving, but living, that we can create beauty and nourishment from the earth. She paused, her expression thoughtful. If you permit it, I would like to restore the garden properly, not to replace what she made, but to honor it by continuing the work she began. The idea should have hurt. The thought of someone else tending Mary's garden, someone else's hands in the soil she'd worked. But instead, Ethan felt something like relief. The garden had been dying slowly for 3 years, just like everything else, and watching it wither had been another kind of torture. That would be good, he said. She'd like that, I think, knowing it wasn't just abandoned. Lincia nodded, accepting this permission, and the conversation moved to practical matters. What needed to be done that day, what supplies were running low, when the next trip to town should be made. Clara listened to it all, occasionally interjecting with her own observations, and Ethan realized with a start that his daughter was participating in the household in a way she hadn't since Mary died. She was present, engaged, alive. After breakfast, Ethan headed out to work on the north fence line that had been damaged in a recent storm. The work was hard and tedious, requiring focus and physical strength, and he welcomed the distraction. But his mind kept drifting back to the cabin, wondering what Lincia and Clara were doing, whether the rhythm they'd established would hold or fracture under the weight of reality. He didn't return until late afternoon, and when he did, he found Clara in the yard, gathering eggs from the hen house with a basket over her arm. She was humming, a tuneless melody that nonetheless sounded like music after years of silence. Got all the eggs? He called out. Clara nodded, carefully balancing the basket. 10 today. Lincia says that's good, that the hens are happy. Where's Lincia? Inside. She's been working on something all afternoon, but she won't let me see until it's finished. She says it's a surprise. Curiosity pulled Ethan toward the cabin. Inside, he found Lincia seated at the table, surrounded by scraps of fabric, thread, and what looked like the remains of an old dress. Her hands moved with quick, precise movements, the needle flashing in the lamplight. She looked up as he entered, and for just a moment, he caught an expression of uncertainty on her face before it smoothed back to calm. I hope you do not mind, she said, gesturing to the fabric. I found this dress in the trunk in your room. It was badly moth-eaten and beyond repair for wearing, but the fabric was still good in places, so I thought... She trailed off, then held up what she'd been working on. It was a small doll, carefully constructed from the salvaged fabric, with embroidered features and hair made from yarn. Simple, but crafted with obvious skill and care. I thought Clara might like to have something of her own, Lin Xia continued, her voice careful. Something made just for her. The dress was too damaged to save, but this way, the fabric, and perhaps some of the memories attached to it, can live on in a different form. Ethan stared at the doll, recognition hitting him like a physical blow. The fabric was from Mary's Sunday dress, the one she'd worn to church and special occasions. He'd kept it in the trunk because he couldn't bear to get rid of it, even though moths and time had destroyed it beyond any use. But now, transformed into this gift for Clara, it became something else. Not a relic of death, but a bridge between past and present. That was her mother's dress, he said, his voice tight. I know, Lin Xia said quietly. I found it folded carefully, wrapped in paper. The way it was stored, I understood it meant something. If I have overstepped— No, Ethan interrupted, surprising himself. No, you haven't. It's good. Mary would have liked this. She was always making things for Clara, always finding ways to bring joy. He paused, struggling with the emotion rising in his throat. You have a good instinct for what's needed. Relief flickered across Lin Xia's face. Clara seems like a child who would value such a thing. Not as a toy to play roughly with, but as a companion. Something to hold when the world feels too large or too lonely. You understand her, Ethan said, the observation coming out with more weight than he'd intended. Perhaps, Lin Xia replied, returning to her careful stitching, or perhaps I simply understand loneliness and the need for something gentle to hold on to when everything else feels uncertain. The door burst open and Clara rushed in, the egg basket still on her arm. Papa, one of the hens got out of the— She stopped, seeing the doll in Lin Xia's hands. What's that? Lin Xia smiled. Come see. Clara approached slowly, setting down the basket, her eyes fixed on the small figure. When she was close enough, Lin Xia held it out. This is for you. I made her from fabric that once belonged to your mother. I thought perhaps you would like to have something to keep you company. Clara took the doll with reverent care, her small fingers tracing the embroidered face, the yarn hair, the carefully sewn dress. Her eyes grew bright with tears, but she didn't cry. Instead, she clutched the doll to her chest and looked up at Lin Xia with an expression of such pure gratitude that Ethan had to look away. Thank you, Clara whispered. She's perfect. She needs a name, Lin Xia said gently. Clara thought for a moment, her face serious. Then, with the certainty of a child who knows exactly what's right, she said, Hope! Her name is Hope! The words settled over the cabin like a benediction. Ethan felt his chest constrict, overwhelmed by the simple profundity of his daughter's choice. After 3 years of darkness and silence and grief, she had named her new companion Hope. That's a good name, Lin Xia said, her voice soft. A very good name. That night, after Clara had gone to bed with Hope tucked carefully under her arm, Ethan and Lin Xia sat at the table together, the day's work finally done. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of weather changing. Storm coming, Ethan said, nodding toward the window. Can feel it in the air. How long before it arrives? Lin Xia asked. Day or two, maybe. Hard to say for certain. He paused, then added, We should go into town tomorrow. Stock up on supplies before the weather turns. Winter's coming earlier than usual this year. Lin Xia's hands stilled on the mending she'd been working on. Will that be acceptable? For me to accompany you to town? The question revealed her awareness of the tensions that existed, the whispers she'd undoubtedly heard on the platform, the judgment that would come from appearing publicly as his wife. Ethan had been dreading this moment, knowing they couldn't avoid it forever but wishing they could. You're my wife, he said, the words coming out more forcefully than he'd intended. You have every right to go to town. More than that, you should come. You need to know what supplies are available, what the merchants are like, how things work. And he hesitated, then pushed forward. And people need to understand that you're not just some temporary arrangement. You're part of this family now. Even though our marriage is only a practical arrangement? Lin Xia asked, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. The arrangement is practical, Ethan agreed. But that doesn't mean it's not real. You live here, you care for Clara. You've made this place feel like a home again. That makes you family, contract or not. Linxia studied him for a long moment, and he had that sensation again of being truly seen, all his rough edges and hidden fears laid bare under her quiet gaze. "Thank you," she said finally, "for understanding the difference between what is written on paper and what is true in life." They rode into Redstone Hollow the next morning, Clara seated between them on the wagon bench, Hope clutched in her arms. The sky was heavy with clouds, pressing down on the prairie like a physical weight. The wind had teeth in it now, sharp and cold, promising the storm's arrival. As they rolled into town, Ethan felt the familiar weight of eyes tracking their progress. People stopped on the boardwalk to stare. Conversations halted mid-sentence. By the time they reached the general store, a small crowd had gathered, curiosity and judgment written plainly on their faces. "Stay close," Ethan murmured to Linxia as he set the wagon brake. "And don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong here." She nodded, her expression calm, but he saw her hands tighten slightly on Clara's shoulders, protective, prepared. They entered the general store together, the bell above the door announcing their arrival. Marcus Green, who owned the establishment, looked up from behind the counter. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Linxia, but to his credit, his greeting was professional. "Ethan, ma'am, Clara, what can I help you with today?" Ethan pulled out his list. "Need to stock up before the storm hits. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, lamp oil, matches, and whatever else my wife thinks we need." The deliberate emphasis on "my wife" was not lost on Green, whose eyebrows rose fractionally, but he simply nodded and began pulling items from the shelves. "Heard you got yourself a bride from San Francisco. Didn't know what to believe, but I can see the rumors were true." "This is Linxia," Ethan said, his voice carrying enough edge to discourage further commentary. "My wife, she'll be doing most of the household purchasing from now on, so I'd appreciate it if you'd extend her the same credit and courtesy you've always given me." Green's eyes shifted to Linxia, assessing. "Can you read English, ma'am? Keep accounts?" "I can read, write, and calculate well enough to manage a household budget, if that's what you're asking," Linxia replied, her tone perfectly polite, but carrying an undertone of steel. "I also know the difference between fair prices and those inflated for customers assumed to be ignorant." A flash of respect crossed Green's face. "Fair enough. I run an honest business here, ma'am. You'll find my prices the same for everyone." He paused, then added more quietly, "And for what it's worth, welcome to Redstone Hollow. Town could use more folks willing to work hard and mind their own business." It was, Ethan recognized, as close to an endorsement as Green would give in public. A small thing, but significant in a town where the merchant's opinion carried weight. They were examining fabric samples when the door opened again and Tobias Marsh walked in, the marriage broker who had arranged Linxia's journey. He was a portly man with shrewd eyes and an oily smile, dressed too finely for frontier life. "Ah, Crowell," he called out jovially, "and the lovely Mrs. Crowell. How delightful to see the happy couple." Ethan felt Linxia stiffen beside him. He moved closer, a subtle statement of solidarity. "Marsh," he said, his tone flat. "I trust everything has worked out satisfactorily?" Marsh continued, moving toward them with the confidence of a man who believed his role entitled him to familiarity. "The bride met your requirements? No complaints about the merchandise?" The word merchandise landed like a slap. Ethan felt anger kindle in his chest, but before he could respond, Linxia spoke. "I am not merchandise, Mr. Marsh," she said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the store. "I am a person who entered into an agreement in good faith, seeking an opportunity for a new life. You facilitated that arrangement and were paid for your services. That is the extent of your involvement in our lives." Marsh's smile faltered. "Now see here, I merely meant—" "We know what you meant," Ethan cut in, stepping forward slightly so he was positioned between Marsh and Linxia. "And we're telling you it's not welcome. You did your job. We appreciate it. But Linxia is my wife now, and she'll be spoken to with respect, by you and by everyone else in this town." The store had gone very quiet. Other customers had stopped their shopping to watch, eager for drama. Marsh's face reddened, caught between embarrassment and indignation. "I meant no offense," he said stiffly. "I was simply—" "Papa," Clara's small voice interrupted, cutting through the tension. She'd been standing quietly beside Lin Xia, but now she moved forward, her doll clutched in one hand while the other reached for Ethan's. "Can we get the peppermint sticks? Lin Xia said we could if you said yes." The simple request, delivered with a child's perfect timing, diffused the confrontation. Ethan looked down at his daughter, then back at Marsh. "We're done here," he said. "Green, if you could finish loading our supplies, we'd appreciate it." "Already on it," Green called from behind the counter, making it clear whose side he'd chosen in this encounter. Marsh left shortly after, his dignity somewhat ruffled, and the other customers slowly returned to their business. But Ethan could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Word would spread about this confrontation, about how he'd defended his Chinese wife against the man who'd brought her here. The town would talk. Some would approve, others wouldn't. But the line had been drawn. As they loaded the wagon, Jacob Wheeler approached from the saloon across the street. Unlike Marsh's oily friendliness, Wheeler's antagonism was direct and unashamed. "Crowell," he said, his voice carrying the slight slur of a man who'd been drinking since noon. "Heard you're making quite a statement today, defending your little mail-order bride like she's actually worth something." Ethan turned slowly, deliberately setting down the sack of flour he'd been carrying. "Wheeler, you got something you want to say?" "Just wondering how it feels, knowing the whole town's laughing at you. Bringing in a foreign woman, expecting her to last out here. She'll run off just like the last one, soon as she figures out what a cold bastard you are." "Jacob," Green called from the store doorway, "take your drunk ass somewhere else. This is a place of business." But Wheeler wasn't done. He moved closer, emboldened by whiskey and the small audience that had gathered. "What's the matter, Crowell? Truth hurt? Or maybe you just can't stand knowing that everyone can see what you really are. A man so broken by grief that you had to buy yourself a replacement wife because no woman would choose you willingly." The words were designed to wound, and they found their mark. Ethan felt his hands curl into fists, felt the old rage rising, the fury he'd kept bottled for 3 years, directed at death and fate and his own helplessness. But before he could move, Lin Xia stepped forward. She placed herself between Ethan and Wheeler, her small frame somehow commanding despite the difference in size. When she spoke, her voice was clear and calm and utterly unyielding. "You are drunk, Mr. Wheeler, and saying things designed to provoke violence. But I will tell you something true, something you clearly do not understand." She paused, making sure she had not just Wheeler's attention, but that of everyone watching. "My husband is a man who has endured great loss and continued to provide for his child and his land despite that pain. That is not weakness. That is strength of the highest order." "Your husband bought you like livestock," Wheeler started, but Lin Xia cut him off. "He offered an opportunity, and I accepted it freely. No one forced me onto that train. No one compelled me to come here. I chose this life because I believed it offered something better than what I had, which was nothing. And in the few days I have been here, I have seen more honor in this man's quiet determination than I see in your loud, drunken mockery." She took a step closer to Wheeler, and despite the difference in their sizes, the man actually backed up slightly. "You speak of replacement, as if people are interchangeable things, but I did not come here to replace anyone. Mr. Crowell's first wife was his first wife. I am his second wife. These are different things, and only a fool would confuse them. I honor her memory by caring for the family she left behind. And if you cannot understand that, then you are too simple-minded to waste further words upon." The silence that followed was profound. Even Wheeler seemed stunned into speechlessness. Around them, the small crowd watched with expressions ranging from shock to approval to barely concealed amusement. Finally, Wheeler spat on the ground and turned away. "Ain't worth my time anyway," he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. He'd been thoroughly outmaneuvered by a woman half his size, and everyone knew it. Lin Xia turned back to the wagon, her expression serene, as if she'd done nothing more dramatic than comment on the weather. But Ethan saw the slight tremor in her hands as she climbed onto the bench, the only sign that the confrontation had cost her anything. They finished loading in silence, Clara watching everything with wide eyes. When they finally started back toward the ranch, the storm clouds even darker overhead, Ethan found his voice. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Defend me like that." "Yes, I did," Lin Xia replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Because what he said was not only cruel but untrue. And because if I did not establish from the beginning that such disrespect will not be tolerated, it would only grow worse. You made an enemy today, Ethan warned. Wheeler's not the type to forget being humiliated by a woman. Then he will be my enemy, Linxia said simply. I have survived worse than the anger of drunk men. And besides, she glanced at him, something almost like humor flickering in her dark eyes. You were about to hit him. I could see it in your stance. That would have been far more problematic than words. She was right, of course. Ethan had been seconds away from throwing a punch that would have ended in a brawl, possibly arrest, certainly in escalating tensions that would have made every future trip to town more difficult. You're observant, he said. I have learned to read people quickly, Linxia replied. It is a skill one develops when survival depends on understanding danger before it strikes. Clara had been quiet through all of this, but now she spoke up. Linxia, are people going to be mean to you because you're from China? Linxia considered the question with the same honesty she brought to everything. Some people will be, yes. Some people fear what is different, and their fear makes them cruel. But not everyone is like that. Mr. Green treated us fairly, and there will be others who judge based on character rather than appearance. What should I do if someone's mean to you? Clara asked, her small face serious. Tell them they are wrong, Linxia said, with dignity and firmness, the way I did today. Do not let cruelty go unchallenged, but do not respond with cruelty yourself. That is how we remain better than those who would diminish us. Clara nodded, absorbing this wisdom, and Ethan felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who'd entered their lives and immediately begun teaching his daughter not just practical skills, but how to navigate a world that could be harsh and unfair. The first drops of rain began to fall as they reached the ranch, fat and cold, splattering against the wagon bed. By the time they'd unloaded the supplies and gotten the horses into the barn, the storm had arrived in earnest. Wind howling across the prairie, rain driving sideways, thunder rolling across the sky like artillery. They huddled in the cabin as the storm raged outside, the newly repaired roof holding firm against the deluge. Linxia prepared a simple dinner while Ethan checked the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. Clara sat at the table with Hope, telling the doll stories about their trip to town, her child's voice a bright thread against the darkness outside. As they ate, Ethan found himself studying Linxia across the table. She'd been in their lives for less than a week, yet already she'd transformed not just the physical space of the cabin, but the emotional landscape of their existence. Clara was talking again, laughing again, participating in life again. The house was clean and warm and filled with the smells of good food. And he was beginning to feel something other than the numbing grief that had defined him for 3 years. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. But something like possibility. Like maybe the future held more than just endless work and hollow nights. Thank you, he said abruptly, the words interrupting Linxia's explanation to Clara about how to properly fold napkins. Both of them looked at him with surprise. For what? Linxia asked. For today. For standing up to Wheeler. He gestured around the cabin, struggling to articulate everything he meant. For all of this. For making this feel like a home again. Linxia's expression softened. You do not need to thank me for fulfilling the agreement we made. This is my home now, too. I have as much interest in making it good as you do. It's more than the agreement, Ethan insisted. You could do the work without caring, without putting your whole heart into it. But you don't. You make dolls for Clara. You defend our family to drunk bullies. You cook meals that taste like something worth living for instead of just fuel. That's not obligation. He stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence without saying too much, without crossing lines he wasn't ready to cross. That's choosing to be present, Linxia finished quietly. To be here, not just in body, but in spirit. Yes, I choose that. Because I have lived without purpose, without connection, and I know how hollow that existence is. She gestured around the cabin, at Clara, at him. This is not hollow. This is real. And I will not waste it by doing only the minimum required. Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin in stark white light. Thunder followed immediately, shaking the walls. Clara jumped slightly, and Lin Xia immediately moved to her side, wrapping an arm around the child's shoulders. "It is only noise," she said gently. "The storm sounds fierce, but we are safe here. Your father built these walls strong." My mother was afraid of storms," Clara said softly, leaning into Lin Xia's embrace. She used to hide in the bedroom when thunder got really loud. It was the first time Clara had voluntarily spoken about Mary in Ethan's presence since the funeral. He held his breath, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had allowed this sharing. "Fear is not weakness," Lin Xia said. "Your mother was brave in many ways, I am certain, but everyone has something that frightens them. For her, it was storms. For others, it might be fire, or darkness, or being alone." "What are you afraid of?" Clara asked. Lin Xia was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute truth. "I am afraid of losing another home, of building something good and having it destroyed by forces I cannot control. That fear lives in my heart always, like a shadow that follows me everywhere I go." "But you came here anyway," Clara observed, "even though you were afraid." "Yes," Lin Xia agreed, "because sometimes the only way to overcome fear is to walk directly into it, to choose hope even when fear whispers that hope is foolish." She glanced at the doll in Clara's arms. "That is why I think hope is such a perfect name, because hope is the thing we choose when everything else tells us to give up." Clara looked at the doll, then at Lin Xia, then across the table at Ethan. In her young face, he saw something shifting, understanding, perhaps, or acceptance. The recognition that their strange new family, formed from necessity and loss, might actually become something real. The storm raged through the night, but inside the cabin they were warm and dry and, for the first time in longer than Ethan could remember, together in more than just physical proximity. When morning came, the world had been scrubbed clean by rain. Everything looked sharper, brighter, more alive. And as Ethan stood in the doorway, watching Lin Xia and Clara work together in the garden, pulling weeds and salvaging what plants had survived the storm, he felt that small seed of possibility growing into something stronger. Maybe, he thought, Marsh had sent exactly the right woman. And maybe, just maybe, this marriage bought by loneliness could become something neither of them had dared to hope for. Something real. The weeks that followed the confrontation in town settled into something that almost resembled peace. Almost, but not quite. Because beneath the surface of daily routines and small kindnesses, Ethan could feel winter gathering its strength like a predator preparing to strike. The mountains to the west grew sharper against the sky, their peaks heavy with snow that crept lower each day. The wind carried ice in its teeth now, and the cattle bunched together in the pastures, their instincts telling them what the calendar confirmed: the hard season was coming. Lin Xia seemed to sense it too. Her work took on a new urgency, though her movements remained as graceful and deliberate as ever. She spent hours in the root cellar, organizing the preserved vegetables and dried meat, calculating and recalculating their stores. She mended every piece of clothing in the house, reinforcing seams and patching worn spots that might tear in the cold. She lined Claire's boots with wool she'd carefully felted from scraps, and she fashioned thick curtains from old blankets to hang over the windows when the real cold arrived. "You're preparing for a siege," Ethan observed one evening, watching her sort through their medical supplies, such as they were. A few bottles of patent medicine, some bandages, a precious vial of laudanum saved for emergencies. "I am preparing for reality," Lin Xia corrected, her fingers moving over the meager collection with obvious concern. "Winter in the mountains is not kind to those who are unprepared, and we are isolated here. If something goes wrong, we cannot simply send for help." "We've survived 3 winters already," Ethan said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. Those winters had been about endurance, not living, about making it through to spring without caring much whether they actually did. Lin Xia looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes. "You survived," she said quietly, "but survival and thriving are different things. This winter, we will have Clara to protect, not just her body, but her spirit. She is finally beginning to heal, to come back to herself. We cannot let the darkness and isolation undo that progress." She was right, of course. Clara had transformed in the past weeks, still quiet by nature, still carrying the shadow of her grief, but no longer that hollow ghost who drifted through the house like smoke. She laughed now, genuine peals of delight when Lin Xia taught her a new skill, or when Ethan took time in the evenings to whittle small animals from scraps of wood. She asked questions constantly, her curiosity reawakening after years of dormancy. She sang while she worked, fragments of songs her mother had taught her, and though the sound sometimes made Ethan's chest ache, he welcomed the pain because it meant his daughter was alive again. "What do you suggest?" he asked, deferring to Lin Xia's judgment in a way that would have been unthinkable a month ago. "We need more medicine," she said immediately, "especially fever remedies, willow bark, if possible. And I would like to gather certain herbs before the frost kills them, plants that grow wild here, but that I recognize from my mother's teachings. They could mean the difference between life and death if illness strikes." "Your mother was a healer?" Lin Xia's hands stilled for just a moment. "Not formally, but she knew the old ways, the remedies passed down through generations. When I was a child in China, before we came to America, she would take me into the hills to gather plants. She taught me which ones could bring down fever, which could ease pain, which could help the body fight sickness." Her voice softened with memory. "I was young when we left, and much of the knowledge faded, but some things stayed with me. Enough, perhaps, to help if the need arises." "Show me these plants," Ethan said, making a decision. "Tomorrow, before the weather turns worse, we'll ride out and gather what you need. I know the land well enough. If you can describe what you're looking for, I can probably find it." Gratitude flickered across Lin Xia's face, brief but genuine. "That would be helpful. Thank you." They set out the next morning, leaving Clara with strict instructions to stay inside and keep the fire going. The child had protested. She hated being left behind. But Lin Xia had gently explained that gathering medicine required focus and knowledge, and that Clara's job of protecting the house was equally important. "Keep hope safe," Lin Xia had said, pressing the doll into Clara's arms. "And we will return before dark. I promise." The land spread out before them, vast and unforgiving under a slate-gray sky. Ethan led them east toward the creek where willows grew in twisted abundance. Lin Xia rode behind him, her small frame adapting to the horse with surprising ease. "You ride well," he observed. "I didn't expect that." "I worked for a rancher's family outside San Francisco for several months," Lin Xia explained. "They needed someone to help with the household, but also to gather eggs and feed chickens. The mistress taught me to ride so I could check the far coops. I was not skilled, but I learned enough to stay mounted." They reached the creek and dismounted, and Lin Xia moved along the bank with focused intensity, examining plants with careful attention. She found willow easily enough, stripping bark with practiced efficiency and storing it in the canvas bag she'd brought. But she also identified other plants. Some Ethan recognized, others he'd dismissed as common weeds. "This one," she said, kneeling beside a plant with silvered leaves. "We call it by a different name in Chinese, but I believe you might call it sage. Not for cooking, for medicine. It helps with coughs and congestion." "We've got plenty of that growing wild near the house," Ethan said. "Yes, but this variety is stronger, better for healing." She carefully harvested several stalks, her hands gentle despite their efficiency. "And this?" She moved to another plant, this one with small yellow flowers clinging stubbornly to life despite the cold. "This is very good for fever, the flowers especially, but the leaves can also be used." Ethan watched her work, fascinated by the transformation. In the cabin, Lin Xia was quiet competence personified, steady, reliable, almost invisible in the way she moved through her tasks. But here, searching for plants she recognized from half-remembered childhood lessons, she became something else. Focused, intense, almost fierce in her determination to gather what might be needed. "You're worried," he said, "more than you're letting on." Lin Xia didn't look up from her harvesting. "I have learned that preparation is the only defense against catastrophe. I cannot control whether illness strikes, or how severe the winter will be, or whether accidents occur. But I can control whether we have the tools to fight back when those things happen." "You sound like you're expecting disaster." "I am always expecting disaster," Lin Xia said quietly, finally meeting his eyes. "Because in my experience, disaster comes whether you expect it or not. The only difference is whether you are ready to face it." "The simple truth of it," hit Ethan harder than he'd anticipated. She carried her losses the same way he carried his, as permanent weight, reshaping everything that came after. But where he'd responded by shutting down, by building walls against feeling anything, Linxia had responded by preparing, by learning, by refusing to be caught helpless again. Your family, he said carefully. The fire. Could anything have saved them? Linxia's hand stilled completely. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, with visible effort, she began harvesting again, her movements slightly less fluid than before. No, she said finally. The fire was too fast, too complete. By the time anyone knew it had started, the building was already consumed. But afterward, lying in the charity hospital because I had breathed too much smoke trying to get inside, I thought about all the things I should have known. How to treat burns. How to help someone who cannot breathe. How to keep myself from panicking so completely that I became useless. She paused, swallowing hard. I could not save them. But I swore that I would never again be so helpless in the face of catastrophe. So I learned. Whatever I could. Wherever I could. And now I prepare, always. Because preparation is the only power I have. Ethan understood that impulse more than she knew. His own response to Mary's death had been different in execution, but similar in motivation. The desperate need to exert control over a world that had proven itself brutally indifferent to human wishes. You're doing well, he said, the words inadequate but sincere. Clara trusts you completely. That's not something that comes easy to her anymore. She is a remarkable child, Linxia said, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. Stronger than she knows. She has survived terrible loss and continued to be kind, to be curious, to want connection. That strength did not come from nowhere. She learned it from somewhere. The implied compliment made Ethan uncomfortable. Mary was the strong one. You are the one who kept going, Linxia interrupted, her tone firm. Who worked and provided and maintained some structure even when grief made you want to surrender. Do not diminish that. Clara learned resilience from watching you refuse to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. They gathered in silence after that, moving along the creek bank until Linxia's bag was full of carefully selected plants. The sky had darkened further, and the wind carried the promise of snow. We should head back, Ethan said, eyeing the clouds with concern. Storm's coming sooner than I thought. They rode hard, pushing the horses faster than was entirely wise on the rough terrain. The first snowflakes began to fall as they crested the final ridge, and by the time they reached the ranch, the world had turned white. Clara met them at the door, relief clear on her face. I was getting worried. The snow came so fast. We're fine, Linxia assured her, brushing snow from her shoulders as she entered the cabin. And we gathered everything we needed. Tomorrow, I will show you how to prepare these plants for medicine. Would you like to learn? Clara's eyes lit up. Really? You'll teach me? Of course. Knowledge like this should be passed down, not hoarded. If something were to happen to me, you should know how to care for yourself and your father. The casual mention of her own mortality made Ethan's chest tighten. Nothing's going to happen to you, he said, more sharply than he'd intended. Linxia looked at him with surprise, then something that might have been understanding. We cannot know that, she said gently. None of us can, but we can make sure that knowledge survives, even if we do not. The snow continued through the night and into the next day, heavy and relentless. By the second morning, the world outside the cabin had been transformed into a landscape of white silence, broken only by the wind's howling. Ethan checked on the animals, making sure they had shelter and feed, then returned to find Linxia and Clara at the table, surrounded by the harvested plants. This is willow bark, Linxia was explaining, her voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher. We strip it thin and dry it, then we can boil it in water to make a tea that helps with pain and fever. It tastes terrible, but it works. The important thing is to harvest it properly. See how I cut only from living branches and never too much from one tree? We must leave enough for the tree to survive and heal. Clara listened with absolute focus, her small hands mimicking Linxia's movements as she practiced stripping bark. And this one? She asked, pointing to the silvered sage. This we dry completely, then crumble it fine. We can make tea from it, or we can burn it and breathe the smoke, carefully, when someone has congestion in their chest. My mother used to... Lincia stopped, her expression flickering with pain. Used to what? Clara prompted gently. Lincia drew a slow breath, then continued. She used to make a poultice from it, mixed with other herbs, for my brother when he had trouble breathing. He was born with weak lungs, and every winter was a battle to keep him healthy. Her hands moved over the sage, fingers trembling slightly. The medicine helped. Until the fire, he had survived every winter. He was getting stronger, and then… She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Clara reached out and took Lincia's hand, her small fingers wrapping around the woman's wrist. You miss them, she said. Not a question, but a statement of shared understanding. Every day, Lincia whispered. Every single day. Me too, Clara said. I miss Mama every day. Sometimes I forget for a little while when I'm learning something new or playing, and then I remember and it hurts all over again. Yes, Lincia agreed. That is exactly how it feels. Like forgetting is a betrayal, even though forgetting is also a mercy. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, watching this exchange, feeling like an intruder on something sacred. His two girls, because Clara was his, and Lincia was becoming his in ways he hadn't anticipated, sharing their grief with a honesty he'd never been able to manage. It's not a betrayal, he heard himself say, stepping forward into the room. Both of them looked up at him, surprised. Mary wouldn't want you carrying guilt for the times you feel joy, Clara. She'd want you to live, to laugh, to be happy. That's what parents want for their children, not endless mourning, but life. How do you know? Clara asked, her voice small. How do you know what she'd want? Because I'm a parent, Ethan said, kneeling down so he was at her eye level. And I know that if anything ever happened to me, I wouldn't want you spending your whole life sad. I'd want you to remember me, yes, to keep me in your heart. But I'd want you to live, Clara, to find joy and purpose and connection. That's what love means. Wanting someone to thrive even when you're not there to see it. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, and she launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around his neck. Ethan held her tight, feeling his own tears burn behind his eyes. Over Clara's shoulder he met Lincia's gaze and saw approval there, and gratitude, and something deeper that he couldn't quite name. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of being trapped inside the cabin while snow piled against the walls and wind screamed across the prairie like something alive and angry. Ethan had endured such storms before, had learned to treat them as simply time to be gotten through. But this time was different. This time the cabin felt less like a prison and more like a haven. Lincia filled the hours with purpose, teaching Clara the medicine-making she'd promised, but also stories, fragments of her childhood in China, memories of her mother's garden and her father's calligraphy, tales of crossing the ocean to America, and the strangeness of San Francisco with its steep hills and constant fog. She taught Clara simple phrases in Chinese, laughing at the girl's earnest attempts to wrap her tongue around unfamiliar sounds. She showed her how to fold paper into intricate shapes, birds and flowers and stars. And gradually, without Ethan quite noticing when it happened, she began to draw him into their circle. Not forcefully, not with demands, but with gentle invitations that became harder to refuse. Tell Clara about the first time you saw wild horses, she'd say, and he'd find himself sharing the story. Show us how you carved Hope's brothers and sisters, she'd suggest, and he'd pull out his whittling knife and demonstrate his technique. What was this land like when you first came here? She'd ask, and he'd describe the valley before the cabin existed, before civilization had made any mark on the wilderness. On the second night of the storm, with the wind howling so fiercely that conversation required raised voices, Clara asked the question that had clearly been building in her for weeks. Lincia, will you be my new mama? The cabin fell silent despite the storm. Ethan's hands froze on the leather he'd been mending. Lincia's face went very still, and for a moment he saw raw emotion flash across it, longing, fear, hope, and grief all tangled together. Clara, she said finally, her voice careful, I am honored that you would ask me that, more honored than I can express. But she paused, choosing her words with visible care. You already have a mama. She lives in your heart and your memories, and nothing can change that. I could never replace her, and I would never want to. But she's gone, Clara said, her voice breaking. And you're here, and I need someone who's mine. Is that wrong? Lincia pulled Clara onto her lap, wrapping her arms around the child. "It is not wrong at all. It is human. We all need connection, need someone to belong to, but perhaps we can think of it differently." She stroked Clara's hair, her touch gentle. "I cannot be your mother because you have a mother who will always be your mother, but I can be someone else, someone who loves you and cares for you and will always be here for you. We do not have a word in English for what that is exactly. Not mother, not aunt, not sister. Something new, something that is ours alone." "What would we call it?" Clara asked, her face pressed against Linxia's shoulder. "What would you like to call it?" Clara thought for a long moment. Then, with the simple certainty of a child, she said, "Family. We call it family." Linxia's eyes filled with tears, and she held Clara tighter. "Yes," she whispered, "family. That is exactly right." Ethan watched them, these two people who'd come to mean everything to him, and felt something shift in his chest. Not the cracking of ice that had already begun weeks ago, but something deeper. A fundamental realignment of everything he'd believed about his capacity to move forward, to feel, to hope. On the third day, the storm finally broke. Ethan woke to silence. Not the oppressive silence of wind and snow, but the clean, bright silence of a world scrubbed new. He rose and opened the door to find the prairie transformed, snow glittering under brilliant sunshine that made his eyes water. "We need to check on the cattle," he said. "Make sure they survived the storm." "I'll prepare supplies," Linxia said immediately, already moving toward the pantry. "Food and extra blankets, in case you find any in distress." It took most of the day to locate the herd and assess the damage. Ethan lost 2 head, not terrible, given the severity of the storm, but still a blow. The remaining cattle were huddled in the shelter of a rocky outcropping, cold and hungry, but alive. He broke through the snow to reach the feed he'd stored in a sheltered area, making sure they had enough to sustain them until the snow melted enough for them to forage. When he finally returned to the cabin, exhausted and half-frozen, he found Linxia waiting with hot food and heated stones wrapped in cloth for his frozen feet. Clara helped him out of his ice-crusted coat, chattering about everything she and Linxia had done while he was gone. "We made bread, and Linxia showed me how to braid it so it looks fancy, and we sorted all the sewing supplies, and we practiced my reading, and we worried about you," Linxia interrupted gently. "Every minute you were gone, we worried. So eat, warm yourself, and tell us about the cattle." Ethan did, falling into the easy rhythm of sharing the day's events, of being part of a household that functioned as a unit rather than isolated individuals sharing space. And later, after Clara had gone to bed, and he sat with Linxia at the table, checking their supplies and planning for the rest of winter, he found himself asking the question that had been building in him since that first confrontation in town. "Why did you really come here, Linxia? The truth. Not just because you needed work or a place to stay. What made you choose a mail-order marriage to a stranger in the middle of nowhere?" Linxia's hand stilled on the ledger where she'd been recording their provisions. She was quiet for so long that Ethan thought she might not answer. Then she looked up, and her eyes held that deep sorrow he'd seen on the train platform, but also something else, a kind of desperate honesty. "Because I was dying," she said simply. "Not in body, but in spirit. In San Francisco, I was invisible. A foreign woman cleaning other people's houses, sleeping in rooms barely large enough to lie down in, earning just enough to survive but never enough to live. I had no family, no friends, no future. I was simply existing, day after day, waiting for time to pass until I no longer had to endure it." She drew a shaky breath. "Then I saw Mr. Marsh's advertisement. Men seeking wives, willing to offer homes and security in exchange for partnership. And I thought, perhaps this is a chance. Perhaps in a place where everyone is starting over, where the frontier erases what came before, I could find a purpose again, a reason to wake up each morning that was more than just the obligation to keep breathing." "And has it been?" Ethan asked, his voice rough. "What you hoped for?" Linxia met his eyes, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she smiled, genuinely smiled, with warmth and something that looked almost like happiness. "It has been more," she said quietly. "I hoped for a place. I hoped for work that mattered. I hoped, perhaps, for basic dignity and respect. But I have found—" She gestured around the cabin toward the room where Clara slept. I have found family, purpose, a life that feels worth living. So yes, Mr. Crowell, it has been everything I hoped for, and things I did not dare to hope for. Ethan felt his throat tighten. You can call me Ethan, he said. We've been married nearly 2 months now. Mr. Crowell seems a bit formal for people sharing a roof. Ethan, then, Lin Xia said, testing the name. And you should call me Lin Xia, not my wife or Mrs. Crowell. We should at least know each other's names if we're going to be family. Lin Xia, Ethan repeated, and somehow saying her name felt like crossing a threshold he hadn't known he was approaching. They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the lamplight casting warm shadows across the cabin walls, the wind outside reduced to a gentle whisper. And for the first time in 3 years, Ethan allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't just survival, a future that might actually hold joy, partnership, maybe even love. He wasn't there yet. The grief for Mary still lived in him, still shaped his days and nights. But Lin Xia's quiet presence, Clara's returning laughter, the growing warmth of the home they were building together, these things were creating space for something new, not a replacement for what he'd lost, but an addition to it, a continuation of life instead of just an endless memorial to death. That night, lying in bed and listening to the house settle around him, Ethan heard a sound that made him freeze. It was soft, barely audible, coming from the loft above. Lin Xia was crying. He lay still, torn between respecting her privacy and the fierce urge to comfort her. She'd been so strong, so composed, handling every challenge with quiet grace. But now, in the darkness, when she thought no one could hear, she was allowing herself to feel the weight of everything she carried. Ethan made a decision. He rose, pulled on his robe, and climbed the ladder to the loft. Lin Xia was curled on her narrow mattress, her face pressed into her pillow to muffle the sounds. She looked up as his head cleared the loft floor, surprise and embarrassment flashing across her tear-stained face. I'm sorry, she said quickly, wiping at her eyes. I didn't mean to wake you. You didn't, Ethan said gently, pulling himself up into the cramped space. I just heard you and wanted to make sure you were all right. I'm fine, Lin Xia said automatically, then stopped herself. No, that's not true. I'm not fine, but I will be. Sometimes it all becomes too much. The memories, the losses, the fear that this, she gestured around the loft toward the cabin below, that this good thing I've found will be taken away too. Ethan sat down beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance despite the cramped quarters. Nothing's going to take this away, he said. You're part of this family now. That's not temporary. That's real. You can't promise that, Lin Xia said, her voice breaking. No one can. I thought my family in China would always be there, and they weren't. I thought I could build a life in San Francisco, and I couldn't. I thought... She stopped, struggling for control. I'm sorry. You shouldn't have to see me like this. I'm supposed to be the strong one, the capable one. You are strong, Ethan interrupted. But strength doesn't mean never breaking. It means breaking and putting yourself back together and continuing anyway. You've done that more times than anyone should have to, but you don't have to do it alone anymore. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't, he took her hand, her small fingers cold despite the blankets. We're in this together now, he said. You, me, and Clara. Whatever comes, we face it as a family. That's what you taught Clara tonight. That family is what we choose to build together. So let me help carry some of this weight. You don't have to bear it all alone. Lin Xia's composure finally shattered completely. She turned into Ethan's shoulder, and he held her while she cried, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very core of her being. He didn't try to stop her tears or offer empty platitudes. He just held her, providing the solid presence of another human being who understood loss and grief and the terrifying vulnerability of daring to hope again. Eventually, the storm passed. Lin Xia pulled back, wiping her face with the sleeve of her nightgown. Thank you, she whispered, for not making me feel ashamed of this. Nothing to be ashamed of, Ethan said. We all need to break sometimes, even the strongest of us. He stayed with her until her breathing steadied, until the tension eased from her shoulders. Then he climbed back down the ladder, back to his own bed, carrying the weight of new understanding. Lin Xia had come to them as broken as they were, She'd simply been better at hiding it, better at channeling her pain into purpose. But beneath the quiet competence and graceful strength, she was just as fragile, just as afraid, just as desperate for connection as he and Clara had been. They were all healing each other, he realized. Not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through small acts of care and the steady accumulation of days spent choosing to show up for each other. The thought should have terrified him. This growing dependence, this vulnerability that came with caring deeply for people who could be lost. But instead, lying in the darkness with the memory of Lin Xia's tears on his shoulder and Clara's peaceful breathing in the next room, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. He felt grateful. Grateful to be alive. Grateful for this second chance at family. Grateful for the quiet woman who'd stepped off a train and walked into their broken lives with her carpet bag and her sorrowful eyes and her fierce determination to build something good from the ruins of loss. Winter had only just begun. The hardest trials still lay ahead, waiting in the cold months to come. But for the first time since Mary's death, Ethan faced the future with something other than grim resignation. He faced it with hope. The morning after the blizzard broke felt like waking from a nightmare into a world scrubbed raw and new. Ethan stood at the window watching pale sunlight struggle through thinning clouds and tried to process everything that had happened in the darkness. Clara's fever had broken just before dawn, her small body finally cooling, her breathing settling into the deep rhythm of healing sleep. Linxia had collapsed beside the bed shortly after, exhaustion claiming her so completely that she hadn't stirred when he'd covered her with a blanket. He should have been relieved. His daughter had survived. The storm had passed. They had food and fuel enough to last until they could reach town. But instead, Ethan felt hollowed out, scraped clean of everything except a truth he could no longer deny. He was falling in love with his wife. Not the practical arrangement he'd convinced himself was enough. Not the gratitude for her competence or admiration for her strength. Something deeper, more dangerous, more real than anything he'd felt since Mary died. And it terrified him more than the storm ever had. Because loving someone meant risking loss again. It meant opening himself to the kind of pain that had nearly destroyed him 3 years ago. And he didn't know if he was strong enough to survive that kind of devastation twice. The sound of movement pulled him from his thoughts. Lin Xia emerged from Clara's room, her hair disheveled, her dress wrinkled from sleep, dark circles under her eyes. She looked fragile and exhausted and more beautiful than anything he'd ever seen. "She's still sleeping," Lin Xia said quietly, moving to the stove to check the fire. "The fever is gone. She'll need rest and food, but she will recover." "You should rest too," Ethan said, watching as she began preparing breakfast with movements that were automatic despite her obvious fatigue. "You've been awake for 2 days straight." "I will rest when I know she is truly safe," Lin Xia replied, measuring coffee grounds with hands that trembled slightly. "When I am certain the crisis has passed." "It has passed," Ethan said, crossing to her, unable to stop himself. "Because of you. You saved her life, Lin Xia, with your herbs and your knowledge and your refusal to give up. You saved my daughter." Lin Xia's hand stilled on the coffee pot. She didn't turn to face him, but he saw her shoulders tighten. "I did what needed to be done. Anyone would have—" "No," Ethan interrupted, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer contain. "Not anyone. Mrs. Henderson ran from far less. Half the women in Redstone Hollow would have panicked and made things worse. But you stayed calm. You knew what to do. You fought for her like she was your own child." "She feels like my own child," Lin Xia said softly, and there was something in her voice that made Ethan's chest constrict. "From the moment I met her, so small and sad and trying so hard to be brave, I felt it. This fierce need to protect her, to give her back the joy that grief had stolen." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I know I have no right to feel that way. I know I am not her mother, that I can never replace—" "Stop," Ethan said, moving closer, needing her to understand. "You're right that you're not her mother. Mary will always be her mother. But that doesn't mean Clara can't have room in her heart for you too. Children are capable of loving more than one person, of making space for new relationships without erasing old ones." He hesitated, then took the final step that brought him close enough to see the exhaustion and fear and hope warring in her eyes. "And you do have the right to feel that way. You've earned it through every moment you've spent caring for her, teaching her, showing her that she matters. Lincia finally turned to face him, and he saw tears threatening to spill from her dark eyes. I was so afraid, she admitted, her voice breaking. When her fever kept climbing, when nothing I tried seemed to help, I was terrified that I would fail, that I would lose her the way I lost my family, that I would have to watch another person I loved die while I stood helpless. The word love hung between them, raw and honest and impossible to take back. But you didn't fail, Ethan said, his own voice thick. You didn't give up. You kept fighting, kept trying everything you knew, and you brought her back. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he took her hands in his. They were small and cold and bore the marks of hard work, calluses and burns, and the stains of herbs. I don't know how to thank you for that. I don't have words big enough. You don't need to thank me, Lincia said, but she didn't pull her hands away. She is part of my family now. You both are. And family does not need thanks for doing what love requires. There it was again, that word, love. Ethan knew he should step back, should maintain the careful distance they'd established, should remember that this was supposed to be a practical arrangement. But standing there in the morning light, with Clara safe in the next room and Lincia's hands in his, all those careful walls seemed like cowardice. Lincia, he said, his voice rough. I need to tell you something. A weak voice interrupted from the bedroom. Papa? They both turned immediately, the moment shattering. Ethan released Lincia's hands and they moved together to Clara's room, finding her awake and clear-eyed for the first time in days. Hey, little one, Ethan said, kneeling beside the bed and touching her forehead. Cool. Still cool. How do you feel? Tired, Clara said, her voice scratchy. And thirsty. What happened? I remember being really hot and everything hurt, and then she trailed off, confused. You were very sick, Lincia explained gently, sitting on the other side of the bed. A fever, the same illness that has taken many children this winter. But we took care of you, and you fought very hard, and now you are getting better. Clara's eyes widened with memory. You sang to me. I remember that. You sang in a language I didn't understand, but it sounded like my mother used to sing, and it made me feel safe. Lincia's expression softened. Yes, I sang you the songs my mother sang to me when I was small and frightened. They are very old songs, older than memory, meant to remind sick children that they are loved and that they should keep fighting. Did they work when you were sick? Clara asked. Every time, Lincia said, and Ethan heard the echo of old grief in her voice. My mother would sit beside me and sing until the fever broke or the pain passed, and I always felt that as long as she was singing, nothing truly bad could happen to me. Clara reached out with one small hand and touched Lincia's face, a gesture of such innocent affection that Ethan felt his throat tighten. Thank you for taking care of me, and for singing my mother's kind of songs even though you didn't know her. All mothers sing the same songs, Lincia said softly. In different languages, perhaps, with different melodies, but the meaning is always the same. You are loved, you are precious, you are worth fighting for. Clara's eyes drifted closed again, exhaustion reclaiming her, but this time her sleep was peaceful and natural. Ethan and Lincia stood simultaneously, moving back to the main room without speaking, both of them processing what had just happened. I should make broth, Lincia said, her voice slightly unsteady. Something gentle for her stomach when she wakes again, and we need to check our supplies. If the storm is truly past, we should try to reach town soon. We're nearly out of everything. We'll need to dig out first, Ethan said, grateful for the return to practical matters, even as his heart still hammered from their earlier conversation. The snow will be deep. It'll take most of the day just to clear a path to the barn and check on the animals. They worked in quiet coordination, falling back into the rhythm they'd developed over the past months. But something had shifted between them during the night, during those hours of crisis when they'd fought together to save Clara. The careful distance they'd maintained had collapsed under the weight of shared fear and shared triumph. Ethan spent the day digging out from the storm, breaking through drifts that reached nearly to his chest, checking on cattle that had huddled together for warmth and somehow survived. The physical labor helped clear his mind, gave him space to think about everything that had happened and what it meant. He'd told himself at the beginning that this marriage was purely practical. He'd convinced himself that what he felt for Lin Xia was just gratitude and respect. But watching her fight for Clara's life had stripped away those comfortable lies. What he felt was deeper, more complicated, more dangerous. He loved her. Not because she'd saved his daughter, though that mattered. Not because she'd transformed his house into a home, though that mattered too. He loved her because of who she was, her quiet strength, her fierce compassion, her refusal to be diminished by a world that tried to make her small. He loved the way she moved through life with grace despite carrying such heavy grief. He loved her honesty, her wisdom, her surprising flashes of humor. He loved her, and he had no idea what to do about it. By late afternoon, he'd cleared enough space to assess the damage. 3 head of cattle lost, frozen in the far pasture. The chicken coop partially collapsed, though the hens had survived. Several sections of fence buried under snow that would need to be dug out and repaired. It could have been worse, much worse. When he returned to the cabin, he found Lin Xia sitting at the table, her medical supplies spread before her, taking inventory with the same careful precision she brought to everything. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "Clara woke again," she reported, "ate some broth and kept it down. The fever has not returned. I think the danger has truly passed." "Thank goodness," Ethan said, relief washing over him again. He removed his coat and boots, brushing snow from his shoulders. "We lost some cattle, but not as many as I feared. We should be able to reach town tomorrow, if the weather holds." "Good," Lin Xia said, returning her attention to the medical supplies. "We need many things, and I should speak with Mr. Green about ordering more herbs. My supplies are nearly exhausted, and winter is not yet finished." Ethan watched her work, noting the tired set of her shoulders, the way her hands moved just a little slower than usual. "Lin Xia, you need to rest. You've been running on nothing but willpower for days." "I will rest when everything is organized," she replied, not looking up. "When I know we are prepared for the next crisis." "There isn't going to be a next crisis," Ethan said, crossing to the table. "Not immediately. Clara is safe. The storm has passed. We survived. That's enough for now." Lin Xia's hand stilled on a bundle of dried herbs. "Is it?" she asked quietly. "Is it enough just to survive?" The question felt loaded with meaning beyond the surface words. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat across from her, waiting until she met his eyes. "What are you really asking?" Lin Xia was silent for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. Then, with the same honesty she'd shown from the beginning, she spoke. "During the storm, when Clara was at her worst, I prayed to every ancestor I could remember. I made bargains with fate. I promised that if she lived, I would never ask for anything more than this: a place to belong, work that mattered, a child to care for. I told myself that would be enough." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a medicine bottle. "But now the crisis has passed, and Clara is safe, and I find myself wondering if perhaps I was too quick to limit what I hoped for. If perhaps there might be room for something more than just survival and duty." Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. "What kind of something more?" Lin Xia raised her eyes to his, and he saw vulnerability there, and fear, and a fragile hope that made his breath catch. "I do not know. I have no right to expect anything beyond the arrangement we made. You have already given me far more than I had any reason to hope for: a home, respect, kindness. Your trust in me with Clara, these are precious gifts." "But," Ethan prompted, needing to hear the rest, "but when I thought I might lose her, when I was fighting to keep her alive, I realized something," Lin Xia continued, her voice growing stronger. "I realized that somewhere in these months, this place stopped being just a refuge and became a home. Clara stopped being just a child I cared for and became the daughter of my heart. And you?" She stopped, seeming to gather courage. "You stopped being just an employer or a husband in name only and became someone I think about constantly, someone whose opinion matters to me, someone I want to make proud." The admission hung between them, brave and terrifying. Ethan felt something crack open in his chest, all the careful protection he'd built around his heart crumbling. "You already make me proud," he said, his voice rough. "Every single day. The way you've transformed our home, the way you care for Clara, the way you stood up to Wheeler and defended our family. The way you fought for my daughter's life without sleeping or eating or giving up even when it looked hopeless. He leaned forward, his hands on the table between them, not quite touching hers, but close. You make me feel things I thought I'd never feel again, things I was afraid to feel. What kind of things? Lin Xia asked, echoing his earlier question. Ethan drew a deep breath, knowing that once he spoke the words aloud, there would be no taking them back. Hope. Joy. The belief that maybe the future holds something more than just grief and work and empty nights. You make me believe that maybe I could learn to live again instead of just existing. Lin Xia's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I feel the same. When I came here, I thought I would spend the rest of my life performing duties and being grateful for shelter. I never imagined I might find a family. Never imagined I might feel... She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish. Feel what? Ethan pressed, needing to hear it. Feel like I belong, Lin Xia whispered. Feel like I am seen and valued for who I am, not just what I can do. Feel like maybe I could be loved again, by people who choose me not out of obligation, but because they genuinely want me in their lives. Clara already loves you, Ethan said, his throat tight. You know that, right? She's not just attached to you or grateful, she loves you. I see it in the way she lights up when you enter a room, the way she seeks your approval, the way she calls for you when she's scared or hurt. And you? Lin Xia asked, her voice barely audible. What do you feel? This was the moment, the choice that would change everything or preserve the careful status quo they'd maintained. Ethan could retreat into safety, could say something vague about respect and appreciation, could protect himself from the risk of loss by refusing to fully invest his heart. Or he could tell the truth. I love you, he said, the words rough but honest. I didn't mean to. I tried not to. I told myself it was just gratitude or attraction or loneliness. But watching you these past months, seeing who you are when you think no one's paying attention, learning your strength and your kindness and your fierce determination, I fell in love with you. Somewhere between that first day when you stepped off the train looking lost and the moment 3 nights ago when you refused to let my daughter die, I fell completely in love with you. Lin Xia's breath caught. A single tear spilled down her cheek, then another. I love you too, she said, the words tumbling out like she'd been holding them back for too long. I have tried to be practical, to remember my place, to not want more than was offered, but I cannot help it. I love the way you care for your land and your animals with such dedication. I love the way you're trying to reach Clara even though it hurts. I love your honesty and your strength and the way you defended me to the entire town. I love you, and I am terrified of what that means. What? Why terrified? Ethan asked, though he knew the answer. Because everyone I have ever loved has been taken from me, Lin Xia said, her voice breaking. My parents, my brother, all consumed by fire while I stood helpless. And now I love you and Clara, and the thought of losing either of you the way I lost them, it makes me feel like I cannot breathe. Ethan stood and moved around the table, pulling Lin Xia to her feet and into his arms before he could second-guess the impulse. She came willingly, pressing her face against his chest, her small body trembling with suppressed sobs. I can't promise you won't lose us, he said into her hair, his own voice thick with emotion. Life is uncertain, and death comes for everyone eventually, but I can promise you this. We're not going anywhere by choice. Claire and I, we're here. We're yours. And however much time we have, whether it's 50 years or 5, we'll spend it being a family. A real family, not just an arrangement. Lin Xia's arms wrapped around his waist, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a shifting world. I want that, she whispered. I want to be your family, your real wife, not just in name. I want to build a life with you, to make memories with Clara, to have a home that belongs to all of us together. Then that's what we'll do, Ethan said, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. But there's something I need to do first, something I should have done weeks ago. He released her and crossed to his bedroom, returning with the small chest he'd kept locked since Mary's death. Lin Xia watched as he opened it, revealing the few precious items inside: letters, a pressed flower, a cameo brooch, and at the bottom, wrapped in soft cloth, a silver ring. Mary's wedding ring, Linxia said softly, recognition in her voice. No, Ethan corrected, holding it up to the light. My grandmother's ring. Mary wore it, yes. But before that it belonged to my grandmother, who gave it to my mother, who gave it to me when I married. It's a family ring, meant to be passed down, meant to mark commitment and love, and the choice to build a life together. He took Linxia's left hand where she still wore the simple brass band he'd given her on their wedding day, the cheapest ring the general store had stocked, purchased because the arrangement required some symbol of marriage. When I gave you that brass ring, it was because I saw this marriage as a business transaction, Ethan said, his thumb brushing over the cheap metal. But that's not what we have now. What we have is real. It's messy and complicated and built on grief and survival, but it's real. And I want you to have something that reflects that reality. He slipped the brass band from her finger and replaced it with the silver ring. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for her all along. This ring represents choice, Ethan continued, his voice rough with emotion. Mary chose me and I chose her, and we built a life together until death separated us. But she's gone now, and I have to keep living, and I choose you, Linxia. Not because I need someone to cook and clean, not because Clara needs a caretaker. I choose you because I love you, because I want to build a life with you, because I want you to be my wife in every way that matters. Linxia stared at the ring on her finger, tears streaming freely down her face now. It is beautiful, she whispered, too beautiful for someone like me. No, Ethan said firmly, cupping her face in his hands and making her look at him. It's exactly right for you. You're exactly right for this family, for this life, for me. Linxia reached up to cover his hands with hers, the silver ring catching the lamplight. I accept, she said simply. Not the ring. That is just metal and stone. I accept you. I accept this family. I accept this choice to love, even though love brings risk. I accept all of it. Ethan kissed her then, gentle and careful and full of promise. It was their first real kiss, unrushed and unhidden, a seal on words that had changed everything. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were shaking slightly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. We should check on Clara, Linxia said, her practical nature reasserting itself even as she smiled up at him with such joy it made his heart ache. We should, Ethan agreed, but neither of them moved immediately. They stood there in the lamplight, hands clasped, foreheads touching, breathing the same air and marveling at how quickly life could shift from survival to something that felt dangerously close to happiness. A small sound from the bedroom broke the spell. They moved together to check on Clara, finding her awake and watching them with knowing eyes. You're smiling, Clara observed, looking between them. Both of you, like you have a secret. Not a secret, Ethan said, sitting on the edge of her bed while Linxia took the other side. Just, things are different now. Better. Your Linxia and I, we've decided that we want this to be a real family. Not just an arrangement, but something true. Claire's eyes went to Linxia's hand, spotting the silver ring immediately. Is that grandmother's ring, the one Mama used to wear? Yes, Linxia said gently. Your father gave it to me. If that makes you uncomfortable. No, Clara interrupted, reaching out to touch the ring with reverent fingers. Mama would like that. She always said this ring should go to someone who loved our family as much as she did. And you do. I know you do. I do, Linxia confirmed, her voice thick. More than I ever thought possible. Clara looked between them again, something ancient and wise in her young face. So, Linxia is really my mother now? Not just someone taking care of me? If you want her to be, Ethan said carefully. Your first mother will always be your first mother, but Linxia can be your second mother, if you'd like that. If it feels right to you. Clara was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then she sat up slightly and looked directly at Linxia. Can I call you Mama? I know you said I should call you Linxia, but if you're really my mother now? Linxia's composure crumbled. She gathered Clara into her arms, holding the child close and pressing her face into her hair. Yes, she said, her voice breaking. Yes, you can call me Mama if that is what you wish. It would be the greatest honor of my life. Clara wrapped her thin arms around Linxia's neck. I love you, Mama. I love you too, my precious girl, Linxia whispered. More than I have words to express. Ethan watched them hold each other, his throat so tight he could barely breathe. His family, his real family, built not from blood alone, but from choice and sacrifice and love that had grown in the spaces between grief. "We should try to get to town tomorrow," he said when they finally separated, his voice gruff to cover emotion. "Let people know we survived the storm, stock up on supplies, and maybe—" He paused, looking at Lin Xia. "Maybe make it clear that things have changed, that you're not just my hired help or my wife in name only. You're my partner, my equal, the woman I love." Lin Xia met his eyes, understanding what he was really saying. The confrontation with Wheeler had established boundaries, but this would be different. This would be a public declaration that their marriage was real, that she belonged to this family by choice, that anyone who disrespected her would answer to him. "The town will talk," she said. "Let them," Ethan replied. "I don't care what they think anymore. All I care about is making sure you and Clara know where you stand. Everything else is just noise." The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold, the kind of cold that turned breath to ice and made exposed skin burn. But the sky was blue and the wind had died, and they had survived the worst storm of the season. They prepared carefully for the trip to town, bundling Clara in layers, packing the wagon with items to trade, making sure the horses were well fed and ready for the journey through deep snow. Lin Xiao wore her best dress, and around her neck she tied a scarf Ethan had given her, made from fabric he'd purchased during their last trip to town. The silver ring gleamed on her finger, impossible to miss. The ride took nearly twice as long as usual, the horses struggling through drifts and the wagon creaking under the strain. But they made it, rolling into Redstone Hollow just after noon to find the town in recovery mode. Shopkeepers shoveling snow, people checking on neighbors, everyone sharing stories of how they'd weathered the storm. Ethan pulled the wagon up to the general store and helped Lin Xia and Clara down. Immediately people noticed them arriving together as a family. Noticed the way Ethan kept his hand at Lin Xia's back. Noticed the silver ring that marked her as more than just a mail-order convenience. Marcus Green greeted them warmly. "Crowell family, good to see you all made it through. Heard the storm was worse out your way." "Clara got sick," Ethan said, and the genuine concern that flooded Green's face told him everything he needed to know about how far they'd come in the town's estimation. "Fever had us worried for a while, but Lin Xia pulled her through with her medicines and knowledge." "That's so." Green looked at Lin Xia with new respect. "We lost 3 children in town to fever during the storm. Doc Brennan couldn't save them, said it was too aggressive and he didn't have the right medicines." "What did you use?" Lin Xia began explaining her treatment, and Green listened intently, asking questions, taking notes. Other townspeople drifted closer, drawn by the conversation. Women who had previously ignored her now asked careful questions about herbs and remedies. Men who had dismissed her as foreign and useless now looked at her with cautious respect. And then Tobias Marsh appeared. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying that same oily confidence. "The Crowell family, looking quite cozy. Tell me, Crowell, is the merchandise still performing to satisfaction, or shall I begin searching for a replacement?" The insult was deliberate, designed to reassert his perceived authority over the arrangement he'd facilitated. But this time, Ethan didn't just defend Lin Xia's dignity. He stepped forward and spoke with absolute clarity, his voice carrying across the street. "Her name is Lin Xia Crowell. She is my wife, not my servant, not my employee, not merchandise. She is the woman I love, the mother who saved my daughter's life when fever nearly took her, and the heart of my household. And if I ever hear you refer to her as anything less than that again, you and I will have a very different kind of conversation." The street had gone silent. Everyone within earshot had stopped to listen. Marsh's face reddened. "Now see here, I was merely—" "You were disrespecting my wife," Ethan cut him off. "The woman who has more courage, more intelligence, and more worth in her smallest finger than you have in your entire being. You facilitated our meeting, and I thank you for that. But that's where your involvement in our lives ends. From now on, you'll treat her with the respect she deserves, or you'll find yourself unwelcome in any establishment I frequent. And I imagine many of these good people feel the same." He looked around at the gathered townspeople, meeting their eyes one by one. "My wife saved my daughter's life using knowledge and medicines that our own doctor didn't possess. She's made our home into something worth living in again. She's shown more grace and strength in a few months than most people show in a lifetime. So if anyone here wants to judge her for being Chinese or for being a mail-order bride or for any other damn reason, know that you'll be judging me too, because she's my family now, and I protect my family." The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Marcus Green stepped forward. "Couldn't have said it better myself," he declared. "Mrs. Crowell, if you're willing to share some of that medical knowledge, I'd be honored to stock whatever herbs and supplies you need. Sounds like you might just save this town a lot of grief come next winter." Other voices joined in, women offering friendship, men nodding respect, even the minister stepping forward to welcome her properly to the community. Not everyone, certainly. Ethan saw a few faces that remained skeptical or hostile, but enough people stepped forward that the message was clear. Lin-Xia Crowell belonged to Redstone Hollow now, and the town would accept her or answer to those who loved her. Marsh left without another word, his authority thoroughly dismantled. And as the day continued, as they purchased supplies, shared their storm story, accepted invitations to visit homes and share meals, Ethan felt the last pieces of his old life finally settling into their new configuration. Mary would always be his first wife, his first love, the mother of his child. But Lin-Xia was his present and his future. She was the woman who'd taken his broken household and made it whole again. The woman who taught his daughter to laugh and hope. The woman he'd chosen and who had chosen him back. That evening, as they drove home through the gathering darkness, Clara asleep between them, Ethan reached over and took Lin-Xia's hand. The silver ring pressed against his palm, solid and real. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything. For staying, for fighting, for loving us." Lin-Xia squeezed his hand, her eyes on the road ahead, but her voice warm. "Thank you for seeing me, for defending me, for giving me a home that is truly mine." "It's ours," Ethan corrected. "Everything we have, we share. That's what family means." "Yes," Lin-Xia agreed, and in the darkness he could hear her smile. "That's exactly what family means." The ranch came into view, its windows dark but welcoming, smoke rising from the chimney they'd banked before leaving. Home. Not just a structure or a piece of land, but something built from choice and love and the courage to risk caring again. They'd survived the storm. They'd faced death and fear and loss, and they'd come through stronger, together. And as they carried Clara inside and settled into the warmth of the cabin, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever storms or hardships or trials the frontier threw at them, they would face them as they'd faced everything else, together, as a family, as people who had chosen each other not out of desperation or convenience, but out of love. The marriage bought by loneliness had become something far more precious, something worth fighting for, something worth keeping, something real. The morning after Clara's fever finally broke, Ethan woke to silence so complete it felt like the world had been wrapped in wool. For a moment, panic seized him, the terrible quiet that had filled the cabin during those desperate hours when his daughter had hovered between life and death. But then he heard it, the soft murmur of voices from the main room, Lin-Xia's gentle tones mixing with Clara's weaker but unmistakably alive responses. He dressed quickly and emerged to find them at the table. Clara sat propped against pillows Lin-Xia had arranged, still pale and fragile-looking, but with color returning to her cheeks. She was eating broth slowly, carefully, while Lin-Xia watched with the focused attention of someone who'd fought too hard for this victory to take any moment of it for granted. "Papa," Clara said, her voice thin but clear. "Lin-Xia says the storm is over." Ethan moved to the window and pushed aside the oiled paper covering. Brilliant sunlight streamed in, so bright after days of darkness that he had to squint against it. The drifts outside had stopped growing. The wind had died to nothing. The sky stretched overhead in a blue so pure it hurt to look at. "It's over," he confirmed, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. Relief, certainly. Gratitude. But also something deeper, a profound awareness that everything had changed in that snowbound cabin, that the three of them had crossed some invisible threshold together and could never go back to what they'd been before. Lin-Xia met his eyes across the room, and he saw his own exhaustion mirrored in her face. She'd barely slept in 3 days, maintaining her vigil over Clara with a determination that bordered on ferocity. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her hair, usually so neatly arranged, hung in a loose braid over one shoulder. She looked worn down to her very bones, and absolutely beautiful. The thought startled him, not because he hadn't noticed her beauty before. He'd been aware of it from the moment she stepped off the train. But this was different. This wasn't the surface appreciation of delicate features or graceful movement. This was recognition of something essential, the fierce strength in her slight frame, the depths of compassion in those dark eyes, the courage it took to fight death itself and refuse to surrender. "We need supplies," Lin Xia said, breaking the moment. The storm depleted everything we had set aside, and Clara needs fresh food, proper nutrition to rebuild her strength. Broth and herbs can only do so much. "See, I'll go to town," Ethan said immediately. "Today, while the weather holds. Get everything we need." "Take me with you," Lin Xia said, and when he started to protest, she cut him off. "Clara is stable now. She can rest here safely for a few hours. And I need to select the supplies myself, specific ingredients for the medicines and foods she'll need in the coming days. Besides," her expression shifted, something determined settling into her features. "It is time." Ethan understood what she meant. Time to face the town again. Time to stop hiding on the ranch. Time to claim their place in the community, whatever reception awaited them. They left Clara tucked into bed with hope, strict instructions to rest and not try to get up on her own. The ride to Redstone Hollow took longer than usual, the roads half buried in snow, the horses struggling through drifts. But the sun was warm on their faces and the air felt different, softer somehow, carrying the promise of change. "Spring is coming," Lin Xia observed, watching a patch of bare ground where the sun had already begun melting the snow. "Even in the midst of winter, you can feel it underneath, life waiting to return." "Another few weeks yet," Ethan said. "Maybe a month, but yeah, it's coming." He paused, then added more quietly, "I wasn't sure we'd make it to spring, any of us." Lin Xia turned to look at him, and he felt the weight of her gaze. "You thought you might lose Clara." "I thought I already had," Ethan admitted, the words scraping out of him. "Those first 2 days when the fever kept climbing and nothing we did seemed to help, I thought history was repeating itself, that I was going to watch another person I loved die and be helpless to stop it." "But you were not helpless," Lin Xia said firmly. "You kept the fire going. You brought water and wood. You trusted me to do what needed to be done. That is not helplessness. That is partnership." The word landed between them, significant and complex. Partnership. It was true, Ethan realized. Somewhere in the crucible of that storm and Clara's illness, they'd stopped being two separate people fulfilling a contract and become something else. A unit, a team, a family. "I couldn't have saved her without you," he said. "The herbs, the knowledge, the sheer determination, that was all you. You brought her back." "We brought her back," Lin Xia corrected, "together, and now we move forward together into whatever comes next." The town, when they reached it, showed signs of the storm's passage. Snow was piled high along the buildings. Several roofs had partially collapsed under the weight. People moved through the streets with the careful deliberation of those who'd survived something harrowing and were still processing the fact of their survival. As Ethan and Lin Xia climbed down from the wagon in front of the general store, heads turned. Conversations paused. The same attention they'd drawn before, but somehow different now. Less curiosity, more assessment. Marcus Green stood in his doorway, and when he saw them, something shifted in his expression. "Ethan, Mrs. Crowell, glad to see you made it through. We were worried, 10 miles out, alone in that storm." "We managed," Ethan said, helping Lin Xia down. "Though it was close, Clara got sick." Green's face tightened with concern. "The fever?" "Yes, but she's recovering now, thanks to Lin Xia." Green's eyes moved to Lin Xia with new respect. "The same fever that took your first wife?" "Yes," Ethan confirmed, his voice steady despite the old pain the words carried. "But this time, we had someone who knew how to fight it." "Chinese medicine," Green said, not quite a question. "Ancient medicine," Lin Xia corrected gently, "passed down through many generations. It does not always work, but when it does, it can accomplish what other methods cannot." "Well," Green said, stepping back to let them enter. I'm glad it worked. A child's life, that's what matters. He paused, then added, Town's been talking, about you two. Some saying harsh things, some saying it won't last. But I figure anyone who can keep a family alive through a storm like that has earned the right to be left in peace. It was, Ethan recognized, as close to an endorsement as they'd get from the cautious merchant. A small thing, but significant. They were examining supplies when the door opened and Jacob Wheeler walked in. He'd clearly been drinking already, despite the early hour, his face flushed and his movements unsteady. When he saw Lin Xia, something ugly twisted his features. Well, well, he said, his voice carrying through the store. The China doll's still here. Thought the storm would have scared you back to San Francisco by now. Ethan felt his jaw clench, but before he could respond, Green spoke up sharply. Wheeler, you're drunk and you're not welcome in my store in that condition. Get out. I'm a paying customer, Wheeler started, but Green cut him off. Not when you're looking to start trouble, you're not. Out. Now. Wheeler's eyes narrowed, focusing on Lin Xia with drunken malice. You think you're something special, don't you? Coming in here, acting like you belong. But everyone knows what you really are. Just a bought woman. A replacement for something better. The words were designed to wound, and Ethan felt rage kindle in his chest. But Lin Xia's hand on his arm stopped him. She stepped forward, her small frame somehow commanding, her voice clear and unwavering. Mr. Wheeler, I have tried to be patient with your discourtesy. I have ignored your insults and your drunken provocations. But I will tell you something now, and I want you to hear it clearly. She paused, making sure she had not just Wheeler's attention, but that of everyone in the store. I am not a replacement for anything. I am my own person, with my own history and my own worth. And yes, I came here through an arrangement that you find distasteful. But I have made this place my home. I have fought to keep this family alive through winter and sickness and hardship. I have earned my place here. You've earned nothing, Wheeler spat. You're just, she's my wife. Ethan's voice cut through the store like a blade, cold and absolute. He stepped forward, placing himself between Wheeler and Lin Xia, his full height and breadth suddenly very evident. Her name is Lin Xia Crowell, and she is my wife. Not my housekeeper. Not my arrangement. My wife. And if you or anyone else in this town has a problem with that, you take it up with me. The silence that followed was profound. Wheeler stared at him, some of the drunken bravado draining from his face as he recognized how close he was to crossing a line that would end in violence. You heard him, Green said into the quiet. Mrs. Crowell is a respected member of this community, same as any married woman. And Wheeler, you're barred from my store until you can demonstrate basic human decency. Get out! Wheeler looked around the store, seeing the expressions on other customers' faces, some supportive, some neutral, but none encouraging his behavior. He was being publicly rejected, and he knew it. Fine, he muttered, stumbling toward the door. But don't come crying to me when she runs off like they all do. When you realize you tied yourself to something that'll never really be one of us. He left, the door slamming behind him, and the store slowly returned to normal activity. But Ethan stood frozen, Wheeler's words echoing in his mind. Something that'll never really be one of us. He turned to Lin Xia and saw her standing very still, her expression carefully neutral, but her hands trembling slightly at her sides. Lin Xia, he started, but she shook her head. We should finish our shopping, she said quietly. Clara needs us to return quickly. They completed their purchases in relative silence, though several townspeople made a point of greeting Lin Xia respectfully as they passed. Mrs. Peterson, the school teacher, actually stopped to introduce herself and express hope that Clara would be well enough to attend school in the spring. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight, public acceptance from a respected community member. On the ride back, Ethan couldn't shake Wheeler's words. The ugly implication that Lin Xia would never truly belong, never be accepted, always be seen as something foreign and separate. I'm sorry, he said abruptly, for Wheeler. For the way some people in this town treat you. You are not responsible for other people's prejudices, Lin Xia replied, her eyes on the horizon. No, but I brought you here. I asked you to come to a place where I knew you'd face that kind of treatment. I should have, I don't know. warned you more clearly, prepared you better. Ethan, Lincia said, and it was the first time she'd used his given name instead of the formal Mr. Crowell. The sound of it stopped him. I knew what I was coming to. Did you think I was ignorant of how the world works? I have spent my entire life being seen as different, as foreign, as something that doesn't quite fit. In San Francisco and every place I have lived, I did not come here expecting acceptance. I came here hoping for purpose. And have you found it? The question came out more vulnerable than Ethan intended. Lincia turned to look at him fully, and what he saw in her eyes took his breath away. Yes, she said simply. I have found it, in this work, in caring for Clara, in building something good from nothing, in... She hesitated, then continued, in being part of something larger than myself. A family. Even if it began as an arrangement, it has become real. At least, it has for me. For me too, Ethan said, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff into unknown air. Lincia, I want you to know what I said in the store about you being my wife. I didn't say it just to shut Wheeler up. I meant it. You are my wife. Not just on paper, not just as an arrangement. He struggled for words adequate to what he felt. You're the person who brought my daughter back from death. The person who made my house a home again. The person who makes me want to be better than I've been. That's not a contract. That's real. Tears shimmered in Lincia's eyes, though she didn't let them fall. When I accepted this arrangement, she said softly, I told myself I was doing it for practical reasons, for survival, for a place to belong. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that. You and Clara, you became my family. And I realized I would fight for this family with everything I have, not because of obligation, but because I choose to. Because you have given me something I thought I had lost forever, a home. The wagon rolled on through the melting snow, carrying them back toward that home. And Ethan felt something fundamental shift in his chest, the last walls of ice around his heart finally cracking, letting in warmth and light, and the terrifying, wonderful possibility of loving again. When they reached the ranch, Clara was awake and sitting up, looking stronger. She smiled when they entered, and Ethan saw his daughter truly present for the first time in years, not just physically alive, but engaged with life, reaching toward the future instead of being trapped in the past. Over the following days, as Clara's strength returned and the snow continued its retreat, the rhythm of their household settled into something new. Ethan found himself seeking out Lincia's company, not just for practical matters, but for conversation, for her perspective, for the simple comfort of her presence. They would sit together after Clara went to bed, talking about the day's work, about plans for the spring planting, about memories and hopes and fears. One evening, about a week after their trip to town, Ethan found himself telling Lincia about Mary, really telling her, not just brief facts, but the whole story. How they'd met at a church social in Denver. How she'd been so full of light and laughter. How she'd agreed to marry him and come to this harsh land because she believed in building something together. How her death had shattered him so completely he'd forgotten how to be anything but broken. I loved her, he said, staring into the fire. I still do, in a way. That doesn't just disappear. No, Lincia agreed quietly. Love does not disappear. It changes shape, perhaps, becomes memory instead of presence, but it remains. Does that bother you? Ethan asked, turning to face her. Knowing that part of my heart still belongs to someone else? Lincia considered this carefully. When I married you, I did not expect to be your first love, or your only love. I expected to be your practical choice, your solution to a problem. But what we have built here, it is not diminished by what came before. Your love for Mary made you the father Clara needed, the man who could endure loss and keep going. That is part of who you are, and I would not ask you to erase it. But what about you? Ethan pressed. What do you deserve? I deserve to be chosen, Lincia said, and for the first time he heard something raw in her voice. Not as a replacement or a convenience, but as myself. I deserve to be seen and valued for who I am, not just for the role I fill. And I deserve, she paused, gathering courage, to be loved, if love is something you have to give. The vulnerability in her admission cracked something open in Ethan's chest. He'd been so focused on his own grief, his own healing, that he hadn't fully considered what Lin Xia might want or need beyond security and purpose. I see you, he said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. I see your strength and your kindness and your courage. I see how you've transformed this place, this family. I see... He stopped, then pushed forward. I see the woman I'm falling in love with. Lin Xia's breath caught. Ethan! I'm not good with words, he continued, needing to get it all out before courage failed him. I'm rough and hard, and I carry too much old grief, but you make me want to be more than that. You make me believe I could be worthy of something good again. And I know this started as an arrangement, but if you're willing, if you want, I'd like to make it real, in every way. For a long moment, Lin Xia said nothing. Then she reached across the space between them and took his hand. The first time she'd initiated such contact. Her fingers were small and delicate in his work-roughened palm, but her grip was strong. I would like that too, she said softly. Very much. The kiss, when it came, was tentative and careful. Two people learning each other, learning this new language of intimacy after so much loss and loneliness. But it was also real and honest and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, Lin Xia smiled, a full, genuine expression that transformed her whole face. There is something I want to show you, she said. Wait here. She disappeared into the bedroom she'd been using and returned carrying something wrapped in cloth. When she unwrapped it, Ethan saw a small wooden box, beautifully carved with intricate designs. This was my mother's, Lin Xia explained. One of the few things I saved from the fire. I have kept it with me through everything, even when I had to sell other possessions to survive. Inside, she opened it carefully, are things that matter. The box contained a few precious items. A jade pendant on a silk cord, a small painted portrait of a young couple, a lock of dark hair tied with red thread, and a letter written in Chinese characters. My family, Lin Xia said, touching the portrait gently. My parents on their wedding day. This is all I have left of them. She paused, then lifted out the jade pendant. This was meant to be mine when I married. My mother wore it, and her mother before her. It represents, she searched for the English words, continuation, the linking of past and future. She held it out to Ethan. I would like you to have this, not as a possession, but as a symbol. We both carry our pasts, your love for Mary, my loss of my family, but we can also carry them forward together, creating something new that honors what came before while building toward what comes next. Ethan took the pendant carefully, feeling the weight of trust she was placing in him. I can't take this. It's your family's, and you are my family now, Lin Xia interrupted gently. You and Clara. This represents continuation, and that is what we are doing, continuing life, building a future. I want you to keep it safe, for us, for Clara, for the family we are becoming. The gesture overwhelmed him. Ethan set the pendant down carefully and pulled Lin Xia into his arms, holding her close, feeling her warmth and solidity against him. She fit there perfectly, her head tucking under his chin, her arms wrapping around his waist. I don't deserve you, he murmured into her hair. That is not for you to decide, Lin Xia replied, her voice muffled against his chest. I choose you. That is enough. They stood like that for a long time, learning the shape of each other, the rhythm of shared breathing, the comfort of not being alone. The next morning, Ethan woke early and made a decision. He dressed quietly and slipped out of the cabin, heading for the barn. In the back corner, buried under old tack and forgotten tools, was a wooden chest he hadn't opened in 3 years. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was Mary's jewelry box. He'd put it away after the funeral, unable to look at the simple treasures she'd collected over their years together. Now, he opened it and searched until he found what he was looking for. A silver ring, delicate and beautiful, set with a small blue stone the color of mountain lakes. He'd bought it for Mary during one of their rare trips to Denver, saving for months to afford it. She'd worn it every day until sickness had made her fingers too swollen to bear the weight. After she died, he'd locked it away, thinking he could never bear to see it worn by anyone else. But looking at it now, he realized that keeping it locked away was not honoring Mary's memory. It was allowing fear to steal from the future. Mary had loved beautiful things, had believed in joy and hope, and the continuation of life. She wouldn't have wanted this ring to sit forgotten in darkness. She would have wanted it to live again, to be part of building something good. Ethan cleaned the ring carefully, polishing away 3 years of tarnish until it shone again in the morning light. Then he returned to the cabin where Lin Xia was starting breakfast and Clara was setting the table. "Lin Xia," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "could you come here for a moment?" She approached, curiosity and slight concern in her expression. Clara followed, sensing something significant. Ethan took Lin Xia's hand and she let him, her dark eyes searching his face. "When I asked you to come here," he said, "it was as a practical arrangement, a solution to a problem. I needed help, and you needed a home. But you've given me so much more than I asked for. You've given me my daughter back. You've given me a home instead of just a house. You've given me hope for the future instead of just endless days to survive." He paused, gathering courage, aware of Clara watching with wide eyes. "This ring belonged to Mary," he continued, opening his palm to show it. "I've kept it locked away because I thought seeing it would be too painful. But I realize now that pain comes from holding too tight to what's gone, not from honoring the past while building toward the future." Lin Xia's breath caught as understanding dawned. "I'm not trying to replace Mary," Ethan said, needing her to understand. "I'm not trying to pretend the past didn't happen, but I'm choosing the future. I'm choosing you. Not as a convenience or an arrangement, but as my wife in truth, as the woman I love, as the person I want to build a life with." He held out the ring. "Will you accept this? Not as Mary's ring, but as my promise to you, my commitment to the family we're building together." Tears spilled down Lin Xia's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I will." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all along for this moment, this woman, this new beginning. Clara, who had been silent through all of this, suddenly rushed forward and threw her arms around both of them. "Does this mean Lin Xia is really my mother now?" she asked, her voice muffled against their joined embrace. Lin Xia knelt down to Clara's level, still holding Ethan's hand. "I will never be the mother who gave birth to you," she said gently. "That was Mary, and she will always hold that special place. But if you want me to be your mother in a different way, to care for you and love you and be there for you as you grow, then yes, I would be honored to be your mother." "I want that," Clara said, throwing her arms around Lin Xia's neck. "I want that so much." They stayed like that for a long moment, the three of them wrapped together, a family forged, not from blood or expectation, but from choice and courage and love earned through hardship. When they finally pulled apart, Lin Xia wiped her eyes and laughed, a sound of pure joy that filled the cabin like sunlight. "Well," she said, "I suppose we should eat breakfast before it gets cold. We have a busy day ahead. Spring is coming, and there is much work to do." The work of spring did come, relentless and demanding. As the snow melted and the frozen earth began to thaw, the ranch demanded every ounce of their attention. Fences needed mending, fields needed preparing for planting, cattle needed tending after the harsh winter, the house needed repairs where ice and wind had found weaknesses. But now they worked together, a true partnership. Ethan taught Lin Xia about ranching, how to read the land, how to handle livestock, how to predict weather by watching the sky. Lin Xia taught Ethan about patience and gentleness, about finding beauty in small moments, about building a home instead of just maintaining a property. And Clara thrived, growing stronger every day, her laughter returning, her spirit rekindling. She worked alongside them in the garden, learning from Lin Xia how to coax life from the earth. She followed Ethan on his rounds, learning the ways of the ranch. She was present and engaged and alive in a way she hadn't been since Mary's death. One evening in early April, as the prairie began to green and wildflowers started pushing through the wet earth, Lin Xia presented Ethan and Clara with a surprise. She'd been working on it secretly for weeks, and now she revealed it, a small garden plot beside the cabin, carefully planted with seeds she'd ordered special from San Francisco. "It's a Chinese garden," she explained, showing them the precise rows, the careful planning. Herbs and vegetables from my homeland, grown here in American soil. I thought, she paused, emotion thick in her voice. I thought we could blend our histories together. American crops and Chinese crops, growing side by side. Different but complementary, like our family. Ethan pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. It's perfect, he said, just like you. That night, as they lay together in the bed they now shared, Lin Xia traced patterns on Ethan's chest, her fingers light and contemplative. Do you ever wonder, she asked quietly, what would have happened if I hadn't come? If Marsh had sent someone else, or if you decided not to send for anyone at all? Ethan caught her hand, pressing it flat against his heart. I try not to think about it, he admitted, because the idea of not having you here, it's unbearable now. You saved Clara's life. You saved mine too, in a different way. You pulled us both back from the edge of just existing and reminded us how to live. You saved me too, Lin Xia said softly. I was so lost after the fire, so alone. I had nowhere to belong, no purpose, no future I could see. Coming here, finding this family, it gave me everything I thought I'd lost forever. We saved each other then, Ethan said, and we'll keep saving each other every day by choosing to be here, by choosing this life, by choosing love. Lin Xia lifted her head to kiss him, and in that kiss was everything they'd survived together. The loneliness that had brought them together, the hardship that had forged them into a family, the love that had grown from necessity into something profound and true. Spring deepened into summer, and the ranch flourished under their combined care. The Chinese garden grew lush and green, providing both familiar and exotic flavors for Lin Xia's cooking. The American crops did well too, corn and beans and squash following the traditions Ethan had learned from his father. Clara turned 9 in June, and they celebrated with a small party, just the three of them, but filled with more joy than any grand gathering could have held. Lin Xia made special dumplings and a cake flavored with honey and spices. Ethan carved Clara a wooden horse, carefully detailed and perfect for her small hands. And together they gave her something more valuable than any toy, a sense of belonging, of being cherished, of having a future bright with possibility. On a warm evening in late summer, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Clara suddenly asked, Will we always be together, the three of us? Ethan and Lin Xia exchanged glances, understanding the fear beneath the question. Clara had lost so much already. She needed reassurance that this happiness was real, that it would last. Life is uncertain, Lin Xia said honestly, taking Clara's hand. We cannot control everything that happens, but we can promise you this. We choose each other every day. We choose to be a family. And as long as we have breath and will, we will fight to keep this family together. Your mother's right, Ethan added, wrapping his arm around both of them. This family, the three of us, it's the most important thing in the world to me. Whatever comes, we face it together. Clara nodded, satisfied by this truth, and settled back against them, secure in the love that surrounded her. As summer faded into autumn, Ethan found himself making a trip to town with a specific purpose. He'd been thinking about it for weeks, and finally, he was ready. In Green's store, he sought out the merchant privately. I need to place an order, he said. Something special from Denver. Green raised an eyebrow. What kind of special? 2 things, Ethan said. First, fabric, the finest you can get. Lin Xia deserves a proper wedding dress, even if the wedding already happened. I want her to have something beautiful. And the second thing? Green asked, clearly intrigued. Ethan pulled out a carefully written list. These seeds, they're Chinese varieties, vegetables and flowers that Lin Xia's been wanting but can't get out here. I wrote to a merchant in San Francisco, and he said he could source them. I want to surprise her in the spring, give her the chance to grow even more of her homeland here. Green studied the list, then looked at Ethan with new respect. You've changed, Crowell, since she came. You're softer somehow, but in a good way. She didn't make me softer, Ethan corrected. She made me remember how to feel. There's a difference. The fabric arrived 6 weeks later, silk the color of morning sky, embroidered with delicate flowers. When Ethan presented it to Lin Xia, she wept. It's too beautiful, she protested, running her fingers over the exquisite material. Too expensive for someone like me. Someone like you? Ethan repeated, tilting her face up to meet his eyes. You mean my wife? The woman who saved my daughter's life and brought light back into this house? The woman I love more than I thought I could love anyone. That someone. Linxia laughed through her tears. When you put it that way, I do put it that way, Ethan said firmly. You deserve beautiful things, Linxia. You deserve to be celebrated and honored and cherished. So let me do that. Let me give you this. She made the dress over the winter months, working on it carefully during the long evenings when snow fell outside and the fire crackled warmly. Clara helped, learning to sew fine stitches under Linxia's patient guidance. And when it was finished, a masterpiece of silk and embroidery that combined Chinese and American styles in perfect harmony, it took Ethan's breath away. We should renew our vows, he said suddenly, struck by inspiration. In the spring, when the prairie blooms, a real ceremony with you in this dress. Not because the first marriage wasn't real, but because we've earned this. We've built something worth celebrating. Linxia's eyes shone. I would like that very much. Spring came again, as it always did, with rushing water and greening grass and wildflowers spreading across the prairie in waves of purple and gold and white. On a perfect morning in May, with the sun warm and the breeze gentle, and the whole world alive with possibility, they stood together in front of the cabin. Ethan in his best suit, Linxia in her sky blue silk dress, and Clara between them in a new dress Linxia had made, holding Hope in her arms. They'd invited a few people from town. Green and his wife, Mrs. Peterson, the schoolteacher, a handful of other neighbors who'd proven themselves friendly over the past year. Even the circuit preacher had come, though he'd been surprised to be asked to bless a marriage that was already legal. But this wasn't about legality. This was about truth. I married you once out of necessity, Ethan said, speaking his vows from the heart. But I marry you now out of choice, because you are the strongest, bravest, most compassionate person I've ever known. Because you took a broken man and a grieving child and loved us both back to life. Because every day with you is a gift I never thought I'd receive. He slipped the jade pendant around her neck, the one she'd given him, now returned as a symbol of their joined histories. I promise to honor your past while building our future. I promise to see you, value you, and choose you every day. I promise to love you with everything I am. Linxia's voice was steady, despite the tears on her cheeks. I came to this frontier afraid and alone, expecting only survival. But you gave me something far greater, a home, a family, a purpose. You taught me that love can grow from the most unlikely beginnings, and that families are built not just through blood, but through shared hardship and mutual choice. She took the silver ring from her finger and pressed it into his palm, then reclaimed it as he slipped it back on, the gesture a renewal of his earlier promise. I vow to stand beside you through whatever comes, to care for this family with all my strength, to choose you every day for the rest of my life. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, again and truly, their kiss was witnessed by their daughter, their friends, and the endless prairie sky. And in that moment, Ethan felt something fundamental settle in his soul, the peace of knowing he was exactly where he belonged, with exactly who he belonged with. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Green had brought whiskey, Mrs. Peterson had baked a cake, and the neighbors contributed what they could. They ate and drank and laughed, and for a few hours the harsh frontier felt almost gentle. As the sun began to set and the guests departed, Clara tugged on Linxia's sleeve. Can I call you Mama now instead of Linxia? Linxia knelt down, taking Clara's hands. Is that what you want? Yes, Clara said without hesitation. You're my mama, not instead of my first mama, but also. I can have two mamas, can I? One who gave me life and one who saved it? Yes, my darling, Linxia said, pulling Clara into her arms. You can absolutely have two mamas, and I am honored, so honored to be one of them. Ethan watched them embrace, his wife and his daughter, and felt his heart full to overflowing. The loneliness that had once defined him, that had driven him to send for a mail-order bride in desperation, had been transformed into something he never could have imagined. A family bound not by convenience but by love, not by necessity but by choice, not by fear but by hope. That night, after Clara had gone to bed, Ethan and Linxia stood together in the garden she'd planted, the Chinese and American crops growing side by side, different but complementary, just as she'd said. The jade pendant gleamed against her throat. The silver ring caught the moonlight on her finger. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked quietly. "Answering that advertisement? Coming to this harsh place with no guarantees?" Linxia turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw absolute certainty. "Never," she said. "Not for one moment. Because this harsh place became home. Because the arrangement became real. Because loneliness became love. And because every hardship we endured together made us stronger." She took his hands, lacing their fingers together. "You asked me once what I deserved. I told you I deserved to be chosen. And you have chosen me every day in 1,000 small ways and several large ones. That is more than I ever dreamed of finding." "I'm the one who got lucky," Ethan said, pulling her close. "A practical man making a practical decision, and somehow ending up with the greatest treasure of my life." "Then we are both fortunate," Linxia said, rising on her toes to kiss him, "because we found each other in the darkness and built something beautiful in the light." As they stood there in the garden, surrounded by the fruits of their combined labor, under a sky full of stars, Ethan thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the grief that had nearly destroyed him, the loneliness that had driven him to desperate measures, the foreign woman who'd stepped off a train and into his broken life, and how all of it, every painful moment, every difficult choice, every act of courage, had led to this: a home filled with love, a daughter who laughed again, a wife who taught him that the human heart was far more resilient than he'd ever imagined. The frontier was still harsh. Winter would come again. Hardships would arise. But they would face it all together, this family forged from necessity and tempered by love. And in the end, that was everything. The mail-order bride who'd arrived as a solution to a problem had become the answer to a question Ethan hadn't known how to ask. How do you live again after loss? How do you open your heart after it's been shattered? How do you build a future when the past still haunts you? The answer he'd learned was standing in his arms. The answer was choosing hope over fear. The answer was letting someone in, even when every instinct screamed to stay protected behind walls of ice and grief. The answer was love. Not the easy, uncomplicated love of fairy tales, but the hard-won, battle-tested love of people who'd survived the worst and chosen each other anyway. As autumn painted the prairie in shades of amber and rust, and the first frost sparkled on the morning grass, Ethan stood on his porch and looked out over the land he'd nearly lost to grief. The garden flourished, a perfect blend of east and west. The cabin glowed with warmth and life. Smoke rose from the chimney carrying the scent of Linxia's cooking. Clara's laughter rang out from inside. This was home. Not just a place, but a feeling. Not just survival, but life fully lived. And it had all begun with a desperate letter, a brave woman, and the courage to believe that even in the harshest frontier, even after the deepest loss, hope could take root and grow into something beautiful. Linxia stepped out onto the porch beside him, her hand finding his naturally, instinctively. She didn't ask what he was thinking. She didn't need to. After everything they'd been through, they'd learned to understand each other in the language beyond words. "Spring will come again," she said softly, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. "It always does," Ethan agreed, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "And we will be here to see it. Together." "Together," he echoed, and in that single word was everything they'd built, everything they'd survived, everything they'd become. The wind rose, carrying the scent of sage and prairie grass, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark sang its evening song. The frontier stretched endlessly around them, vast and unforgiving and beautiful, and they stood together in the heart of it, a family born from loneliness and forged in love, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. Because they had learned the greatest truth of all, that home is not a place you find, but something you build with courage, patience, and the willingness to let love transform even the harshest landscape into something worth fighting for. And their home, built from nothing, strengthened by hardship, blessed by love, would endure.